Section 1. The World Behind the World. There is something genuinely strange about settling in with a show you have watched 100 times and realizing you might not know it as well as you thought. Family Guy has been running since the 31st of January, 1999. That is over 25 years. Millions of people have grown up with it, fallen asleep to it, rewatched their favorite episodes so many times the audio has practically embedded itself into their nervous systems. The show is, in a very real sense, background noise for a generation. Comfortable, familiar. Something warm playing at the edge of your attention while the day finally lets go of you. But underneath all of that comfort, underneath the familiar theme song and the instantly recognizable voices, there is a show that has been keeping secrets since its very first episode aired. Mysteries that were written into the fabric of the show and never answered. Revelations that came out 20 years later and completely reframed things you thought you understood. Details so carefully hidden in plain sight that even the most devoted fans have missed them entirely. That is what tonight is about. We are going to take a long, slow, quiet walk through everything that Family Guy has never fully explained. The things that happen behind the scenes that most people never learned about. The questions the writers put into episodes and never came back to answer. The moments where the show accidentally predicted reality with an accuracy that should have been impossible. The characters whose deepest truths were buried beneath layers of comedy and cutaway gags, only surfacing years later in ways nobody expected. This is not a list of quick trivia facts rattled off at speed. This is a story. And like all good stories, it starts at the beginning, with a young man who had an idea that almost never made it to television at all. So get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Let the words wash over you. There is a lot to cover, and we are going to take our time with all of it. Family Guy began, in a meaningful sense, before it was called Family Guy. Before there was a Peter Griffin or a Stewie or a Brian, there were two other characters, a man named Larry and his dog, Steve. These were the central figures in a pair of short animated films that Seth MacFarlane made while he was still finding his voice as an animator. When you watch those original shorts, the lineage is obvious. Larry is a broad, working-class guy with a simple view of the world and a capacity for spectacular poor decision-making. Steve the dog is articulate where his owner is not, observational where Larry is oblivious, and entirely too sophisticated for the situation he finds himself in at any given moment. The comedic engine that would power Family Guy for more than 2 decades was already running in those early shorts, just under different names. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, and he was one of those kids who seemed to arrive knowing exactly what he wanted to do. He was drawing his own comics by the time he was in elementary school. He was animating by the time he was in high school. His talent was obvious enough that he earned a scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most respected art and design institutions in the country. It was there that he developed the 2 short films, The Life of Larry and Steve, that would eventually lead to everything else. After graduating, MacFarlane got a job working in animation, contributing to shows at Hanna-Barbera. He worked on Johnny Bravo, on Cow and Chicken, on Dexter's Laboratory. He was learning the mechanics of producing animation at a professional level, understanding the rhythms and the workflows, and the particular kind of madness that goes into making a cartoon look effortless on screen. But he had not forgotten about Larry and Steve, and neither had some people at Fox, who had seen the shorts and recognized something in them worth developing. Fox called him in. They gave him $50,000 to create a pilot. That money, by the standards of what television development usually costs, is essentially nothing. It is the kind of budget that forces you to be creative in ways you might not have been with more resources. MacFarlane took that $50,000 and built the foundation of one of the longest-running animated series in the history of American television. He renamed the characters, built a family around them, set them in a fictional Rhode Island town, and delivered a pilot that Fox looked at and decided was worth putting on the air. The show premiered right after Super Bowl 33, on the 31st of January 1999. That time slot, immediately following one of the most watched sporting events in American life, is the closest thing television has to a guaranteed audience. 22 million people watched that first episode of Family Guy. 22 million. For a brand new animated comedy about a dysfunctional working-class family in Rhode Island, that is a staggering number. And it was just the beginning of a story that would involve cancellations, resurrections, controversies, near-death experiences, accidentally accurate prophecies, and some of the most fascinating character mysteries ever buried inside a primetime cartoon. We are going to explore all of it, piece by piece, in the quiet dark of wherever you are right now. Before we go any further, though, drop a comment and tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you are. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that someone in one part of the world is falling asleep to this at 2 in the morning, while someone else in a completely different time zone is listening on their lunch break. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe too. It means a lot, and it helps more than you might think. Now, let's go deeper. Section 2. The origin story nobody fully knows. The version of Family Guy's creation story that most people know goes something like this. Seth MacFarlane made some shorts in college, Fox gave him money to make a pilot, and the rest is history. That version is not wrong, but it is the kind of simplified telling that leaves out all the most interesting parts. The reality of how this show came to exist is considerably more fragile and considerably more improbable than the clean retrospective version suggests. And understanding just how close it all came to never happening at all makes the show's subsequent history feel completely different. Let's start with the shorts themselves, because they matter more than they usually get credit for. The Life of Larry was not made as a calling card. It was not a deliberate pitch document designed to catch the attention of a major network. MacFarlane made it because he was an animator who wanted to animate, and the characters he had in his head needed to go somewhere. The short is genuinely rough in the way that student work tends to be rough, but the comedic voice running through it is unmistakably the same one that would eventually be refined into Family Guy. Larry is cheerfully unself-aware. Steve is wry and beleaguered. The dynamic between them generates a specific kind of comedy that comes from the gap between how someone sees themselves and how the world actually sees them. The follow-up short, Larry and Steve, push things a little further. By this point, MacFarlane had refined his instincts. The characters felt more lived in. The jokes landed with more precision. And the fundamental appeal of the pairing, the loud, lovable fool and the quietly sophisticated voice of reason, who happens to be a dog, was fully operational. These shorts ended up being seen by people at Hanna-Barbera, which is how MacFarlane got his first professional animation job. And through the interconnected world of people who work in television animation, they eventually made their way to Fox. There is a version of events in which nothing comes of this, in which Fox sees the shorts and files them away and nothing further happens, which would have meant no Family Guy, no American Dad, no Ted, no Orville, and a completely different landscape for adult animated comedy over the following 2.5 decades. Instead, Fox called MacFarlane in for a meeting. The specific number of $50,000 matters. It matters because it tells you how much the network actually believed in the concept at that point. $50,000 is a gesture. It is enough to produce something, but not enough to produce something comfortably. When you are working on that kind of budget in animation, every decision has a cost attached to it that you feel in a way you would not if the resources were more generous. MacFarlane had to be extraordinarily efficient with what he had. Every creative choice was filtered through the question of whether it was achievable within the constraints of both the budget and the timeline. What he produced under those conditions was a pilot that impressed the network enough to order a series. But here is the part that often gets glossed over. Even then, the path forward was not smooth. Fox initially had a different idea about how to use the material. There was a period in the development process where the thinking at the network level was that the animated characters could be used as short insert segments for another show, rather than as the backbone of their own series. The concept of Family Guy as a standalone half-hour animated comedy with its own identity and its own storytelling ambitions was not, at first, the inevitable outcome that it looks like in retrospect. It was a choice that had to be made by people at the network, and it required them to look at what MacFarlane had created and decide that it could sustain something bigger than filler material between other segments. They made that call. They ordered the show to series. And the version that premiered after the Super Bowl in 1999 was a genuine television event. But even that premiere, despite pulling 22 million viewers, did not guarantee the show's survival. Fox's relationship with Family Guy in those early years was genuinely dysfunctional in a way that goes beyond the standard network creative tension that every show experiences. Fox seemed genuinely unsure what to do with the show, and the decisions they made around its scheduling reflected that uncertainty in ways that were actively damaging to the audience's ability to find and consistently watch it. In the second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening. This placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which at that point was one of the most watched comedies on television with a deeply loyal audience. The ratings for Family Guy dropped. This was predictable. Putting a young, still developing show up against an established hit with a built-in following is not a strategy designed to help the younger show succeed. Then Fox moved it again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it competed against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. That show was at the height of its cultural dominance during this period. It was pulling numbers that most primetime programming could only dream about. Competing against it was, once again, a situation that Family Guy was not going to win. Fox kept shuffling the show. Different nights, different time slots, with little warning and less consistency. The audience, which had shown up enthusiastically for that first episode, had no reliable way to find the show from week to week. The ratings suffered, and by the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. By most measures of television history, that should have been the end. Shows get canceled. Sometimes great shows get canceled. It is a brutal and often arbitrary process, and when a show gets canceled, the machine that sustained it, the writing staff, the production infrastructure, the momentum, all of it disperses. People find other jobs. Other commitments accumulate. The window closes. What happened to Family Guy instead is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of American television. And it started not with a grand gesture from a major network, but with a negotiated deal for rerun rights that nobody thought was particularly significant at the time. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim late-night block. They got those rights cheaply, because nobody thought a canceled Fox cartoon was worth much. The reruns started airing on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and almost from the first night, something started happening that the conventional wisdom about canceled television simply did not account for. The show was finding its audience. The audience it had never been able to build during its original run, because Fox kept moving it around and making it impossible to watch consistently, was discovering it on Adult Swim in the way that audiences discover things when a show is in a stable, predictable time slot, and they can actually plan to watch it. The ratings on Adult Swim climbed. Then they climbed more. Then they dominated late-night viewing in a way that nobody had predicted, outperforming both cable and broadcast competition and boosting Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. At the same time, the DVD releases of the first and second seasons were selling in numbers that absolutely nobody had expected for a canceled cartoon. Over 400,000 copies, which was a genuinely significant commercial achievement for home video at that moment in time. People were buying the show, sharing it, talking about it. The audience that Fox had never managed to hold in one place was coalescing around the show on its own terms, through the mechanisms that cable reruns and home video made possible. Fox noticed. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice began to reconsider. And in 2004, they ordered new episodes. The show would come back for a fourth season in 2005. Everything about Family Guy's creation story, from the early shorts to the $50,000 pilot to the chaotic scheduling to the cancellations to the cult resurrection, is more complicated and more improbable than the streamlined version suggests. That complexity is worth sitting with, because it means that the show you have spent years watching, the one playing quietly in the background of your life, almost did not exist at all. And the version of it that came back in 2005 was already shaped by everything that had happened in the gap. The 3 years away changed things. The writing staff that came back was not the same writing staff that had left. The characters, as they returned to screens, were beginning a slow evolution that would take them far from where they started. But the story of how they got there begins in a recording booth, with one man switching between 4 completely different voices. Section 3. The Man Behind the Voices. One of the most technically astonishing things about Family Guy, something that viewers who have spent years watching the show often do not fully appreciate, is the scale of what Seth MacFarlane does as a voice actor in every single episode. Most animated shows have a cast of performers, each of whom voices 1 or 2 regular characters and occasionally takes on additional roles. Family Guy operates differently at its center. MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, the main character and nominal head of the family. He voices Brian Griffin, the family's literary aspirant dog and Peter's best friend. He voices Stewie Griffin, the diabolical baby genius who communicates in complete philosophical sentences while plotting world domination and matricide. And he voices Glenn Quagmire, the neighborhood's resident sexual adventurer, whose catchphrase has achieved a kind of cultural ubiquity that its creator probably never anticipated. 4 main characters, all voiced by one person, all of them present in the same scenes, interacting with each other, responding to each other, bouncing off each other in ways that require a specific kind of mental flexibility from the performer. When Peter and Brian are having a conversation, MacFarlane is playing both sides of it simultaneously. When Stewie and Quagmire are in the same room, MacFarlane is switching between 2 fundamentally different vocal registers, 2 different character psychologies, 2 different rhythms and cadences and ways of being in the world, often within the space of a single exchange. The logistics of this in a recording session are genuinely fascinating. The Family Guy cast records together, ensemble style, as much as scheduling allows. The goal in the room is to have the actors playing off each other in real time, generating the kind of naturalistic reaction and timing that comes from one human being genuinely responding to another human being, rather than simply delivering lines into a microphone with nobody else present. But when MacFarlane is in those sessions, he is frequently in the position of responding to himself, of switching from Peter's voice to Brian's voice mid-scene, and then pivoting again to Stewie, without losing the thread of who is speaking and what they would authentically feel in the moment. MacFarlane has described his relationship with his voice work in terms that suggest he does not treat it as a casual or automatic process. He has talked about how he brings physical energy to the booth even when the medium does not require it, about how he inhabits the characters rather than simply producing their sounds. He has also been candid about the limits of his own patience with the corporate machinery around the show, once describing his approach to his voice recording schedule as being somewhat aggressive in his defense of his own judgment about when he is and is not capable of performing at the level the work requires. There were apparently times when production schedules pushed for recording sessions at moments when MacFarlane did not feel he could do the voices justice, and he made clear that he would not compromise the work simply because a deadline was looming. But here is something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the voice casting of Family Guy. Brian Griffin almost sounded completely different. When MacFarlane was developing the show and auditioning voices for the characters, Brian was not automatically going to be voiced by the creator. The network auditioned other actors for the role. Several people were brought in, their performances recorded, and the tapes were brought together so that network executives could compare options and weigh in on which voice felt right for the character. Among the people who auditioned for Brian Griffin was William H. Macy. Yes, that William H. Macy, the actor who would go on to anchor Shameless for 11 seasons, whose dramatic work in films like Fargo established him as one of the most reliable and compelling character actors of his generation. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this on Twitter at some point, describing Macy's audition as something he had perhaps not given sufficient credit to, and suggesting somewhat ruefully that he might have made the wrong call in going with himself over someone with Macy's particular gifts. The idea of William H. Macy as Brian Griffin is genuinely fascinating to sit with. Macy brings a specific quality to his performances, a lived-in weariness, a sense of a man who has seen things and would prefer not to be reminded of them, that would have given Brian a fundamentally different texture. MacFarlane's Brian is dry and sardonic, but also carries a note of wistful aspiration, a sense that Brian believes in something better even when his behavior does not reflect it. Macy's Brian would have had more grit to it, perhaps more genuine world weariness, perhaps less of the particular quality of educated pretension that became such a defining feature of the character in the later seasons. We will never know what that version of the show would have been. MacFarlane did the voices himself. The history of Family Guy is the history we have, but the fact that Brian's voice, and by extension his entire characterization and the show's tonal center of gravity, came within a network executive decision of being something completely different is worth sitting with for a moment. And Brian is not the only character whose voice history holds a secret. Meg Griffin, the Griffin family's eldest daughter and the most consistently put-upon character in the show's history, was not always voiced by Mila Kunis. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, an actress who was already established in animation through her work as Eliza Thornberry in The Wild Thornberrys, as well as through her stage work. Chabert voiced Meg through the first season, but the role did not end up being a good long-term fit. After that initial season, she departed the show and Mila Kunis stepped in, taking over the character beginning in season 2 and holding the role ever since. What is particularly interesting about this is how little it is discussed relative to how significant a change it actually was. Meg's voice is, in some ways, her most defining quality. It is the sound of her exhaustion, her longing, her persistent and battered optimism that things might eventually go better. Kunis brought something specific to that, a quality of genuine feeling beneath the comedy of the character's suffering that became part of Meg's identity in ways that are hard to articulate but easy to feel when you watch the show. Chabert has spoken about the departure without particular bitterness. The schedule and the demands were factors, but the transition happened at a formative moment for the show, early enough that for most of the audience who discovered Family Guy during its Adult Swim years, or at any point after the second season, Kunis simply is Meg. The first season, with Chabert's voice, feels slightly different in ways that are subtle but real. The Meg who would endure a decade of escalating comedic abuse is fundamentally Kunis's Meg. The original voice belongs to a different, quieter chapter of the show's history. There is also the matter of how the voices themselves were developed, which is a process that reveals something important about how MacFarlane thinks about character. He has described Stewie as being conceived as a kind of evil version of Rex Harrison, specifically channeling the grand theatrical British quality that Harrison brought to roles like Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. The character was built, from his earliest conception, around a specific performance tradition. He is not merely a baby who happens to sound British. He is a baby performing a particular kind of Britishness that is specifically rooted in a certain mode of theatrical grandeur. Peter's voice is rooted in something different. There is a specific Rhode Island quality to it, a working-class New England sound that anchors the character geographically and class-specifically, in ways that matter for who Peter is supposed to be. The voice is not generic American. It is particular to a place and a way of life, which is part of why Peter, at his best, functions as a recognizable type rather than simply a cartoon archetype. Brian's voice is the one MacFarlane has described as closest to his own natural speaking voice, which makes sense given that Brian is, in many ways, the character most directly drawn from MacFarlane's own sensibility and worldview. The dry, measured quality of Brian's delivery, the sense of someone choosing words carefully even when what they are choosing is a devastating put-down or an admission of failure, reflects something genuine about how MacFarlane processes the world. Quagmire's voice, by contrast, is a specific comic instrument designed to produce a kind of frictionless, cheerfully oblivious male confidence that reads as both absurd and strangely charming. It is a more deliberately theatrical creation than the other three, which is part of why Quagmire works as a comedic presence, even in the show's more troubled later seasons when the other characters had drifted significantly from their original conceptions. One more voice-related secret that deserves attention. MacFarlane fought to keep the opening title sequence, the sung theme song that introduces the show with the Griffin family performing a full musical number. Networks are traditionally nervous about opening credit sequences because of the concern that audiences will change channels during them, and the executives at Fox apparently shared this concern about Family Guy's elaborate opening. MacFarlane pushed back. He believed that the opening theme was a part of the show's identity, that it established something about the tone and the world that the rest of the episode built on. He won that argument, and the opening theme has been a constant presence in the show for over 25 years, one of the most recognizable pieces of animated television music ever created. It was not inevitable. It was a specific creative decision, defended at the level of one person's belief in what the show was. Section 4. The night a hangover saved Family Guy. On the evening of the 10th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane gave a speech at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design. It was the kind of event that successful alumni get invited to, a chance to return to the place where the career began and speak to students who are at the beginning of their own creative journeys. MacFarlane went. He gave the speech. And then, as often happens after the formal obligations of the day are done, the evening extended into something less structured. There was drinking involved. There was the particular kind of relaxed, celebratory atmosphere that comes from being back in a place associated with your formative years, surrounded by people who knew you before you became whoever you became. MacFarlane had a flight to catch the next morning, American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport, scheduled to take him back to Los Angeles. His travel agent had given him the departure time as 8:15 in the morning. The actual departure time was 7:45. That 30-minute discrepancy, compounded by the fact that McFarlane was recovering from a night that had gone considerably later than might have been ideal, meant that when he arrived at Logan Airport on the morning of the 11th of September 2001, the gates for Flight 11 had already closed. He had missed the plane by approximately 10 minutes. He was told to wait for the next available flight. He made his way to the airport lounge. And there, exhausted from the previous night and the early morning, he fell asleep in his seat. He woke up 45 minutes later to the sound of commotion around him. People were watching the television screens mounted throughout the lounge with an intensity that did not belong to normal news coverage. Something had happened. He came fully awake. He looked at the screens. And then the announcement came over the news coverage that told him which flight had been involved in what he was watching unfold on the screen in front of him. The flight he had missed by 10 minutes. The plane that had taken off from Logan Airport at 7:45 in the morning. The one his travel agent had told him departed at 8:15. American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 in the morning, killing everyone on board. McFarlane had missed it by 10 minutes. A half-hour discrepancy in the information his travel agent gave him, combined with a night of drinking that had made the early morning harder than it might otherwise have been, had placed him in the airport lounge watching the news coverage rather than on the plane that would become, in the space of 40 minutes, one of the most consequential aircraft in American history. He called his assistant to let him know he was on the next flight and was fine, but the message did not reach people in time. For approximately 20 minutes, people who knew he was supposed to be on that flight did not know whether he had made it or not. That 20 minutes of uncertainty is a detail that does not get discussed much, but it is worth sitting with, because it speaks to the human reality of those hours when information was moving slowly and imperfectly, and the people closest to events were not able to communicate clearly. McFarlane has spoken about the experience a number of times over the years, and his framing of it is worth noting. He has been consistent in declining to characterize the event in terms of fate or divine intervention, or any framework that ascribes special meaning to the fact that he survived while others did not. His stated position is that coincidences happen constantly in human life, that any given person has hundreds of near misses in the course of a year that they never know about because the outcome was ordinary rather than catastrophic. He has said that a day before the Flight 11 incident, he could have stepped into traffic at the wrong moment and been killed by a car, and the only reason the Flight 11 story carries the weight it does is because the outcome it narrowly avoided was so enormous. That measured, philosophically skeptical response to his own brush with death is revealing. It tells you something about how McFarlane processes experience. It also, perhaps, tells you something about why he was able to continue making a comedy about a dysfunctional family in the years following an event that would have fundamentally restructured the lives of most people who survived it. What is also worth noting is what his survival meant for the show. At the time of the September 11th attacks, Family Guy was in the middle of its original troubled run. The show had not yet been officially canceled the second time, but it was on shaky ground. The writing staff was the one that had built the show from scratch. The characters were still in their original forms. The creative voice that gave the early seasons their specific identity was still directly engaged with the production. If McFarlane had been on Flight 11, Family Guy would have ended that morning. The show would have been canceled in the immediate aftermath, not because of any commercial calculation, but simply because the person whose vision it was would be gone. There would have been no Adult Swim revival, no fourth season return, no 20-plus seasons of subsequent episodes, for better or worse. The entire arc of the show, its resurrection, its evolution, its controversial decisions, its occasional moments of genuine brilliance, all of it exists because a travel agent wrote down the wrong departure time and a night of celebration ran slightly longer than planned. And there is one more layer to this story that tends to get overshadowed by the larger facts. Several years after the September 11th attacks, Family Guy made an episode that directly engaged with them. In the Season 10 episode titled Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the events of the very first episode of the show. While they are there, the episode grapples with the question of whether foreknowledge of September 11th carries an obligation to prevent it, and it handles that question in a way that generated its own controversy. Brian attempts to prevent the attacks. The consequences of that intervention turn out to be worse than the original events. A version of the story ultimately has to allow September 11th to happen in order to avoid a worse outcome. It is a dark and philosophically uncomfortable place for a comedy to go, and the episode ends with a moment of characters celebrating a decision that involved allowing a historic atrocity to occur because the alternative was worse. MacFarlane himself was supposed to be on one of the planes that morning. He is the person who wrote the show that eventually made comedy about those events. That specific layer of personal history threading through the fictional treatment is something the show never explicitly acknowledged. It exists in the background of the episode, unspoken, available to anyone who knows the full story. There was also a pre-September 11th gag in the episode Road to Rhode Island, which aired in the year 2000, that featured Osama bin Laden in an airport security context. When the DVD version of this episode was released, that particular gag was removed. The timing of the joke relative to subsequent events made it uncomfortable in ways that nobody could have anticipated when it was written, which is one of the stranger forms of eerie television coincidence in the show's history. We will come back to Family Guy's peculiar relationship with predicting the future in a later section. For now, just file that detail away. It becomes more interesting in context. The story of September 11th and Seth MacFarlane exists at the intersection of genuine historical tragedy and a very particular kind of accident that changed the course of entertainment history. The show, the one that has been playing quietly in the background of American popular culture for over a quarter century, is there because of a travel agent's mistake and a celebration that ran late. Everything that came after, every character development and controversial episode and ASMR late-night rewatching session flows from that 10-minute gap at Boston's Logan Airport on a September morning in 2001. Section 5. Stewie's Deepest Secrets. If you had to identify the single most mysterious character in Family Guy, the one whose true nature the show has most consistently refused to resolve or explain, Stewie Griffin would be the answer without much competition. On the surface, Stewie's mystery seems simple enough. He is a baby who talks. He has the intellect and vocabulary of an adult, or more specifically, the intellect and vocabulary of a very particular kind of adult, the kind who reads 19th century literature and has strong opinions about the dramatic structure of Victorian theater, while also being capable of designing functional weapons in a nursery. He speaks with a refined British accent that places him somewhere in the tradition of a certain theatrical upper-class Englishness that is both specific and slightly heightened, as if the performance itself is always slightly aware of being performed. The mystery, as it is usually framed, is whether the other characters can hear him. The adults in Stewie's world respond to him inconsistently. In some scenes, they appear completely oblivious to his elaborate speeches, treating whatever sounds they hear from him as normal infant babbling. In others, they react to specific things he says. Peter has occasionally responded to Stewie in ways that suggest he has understood him. Lois sometimes responds directly. Other characters, particularly in later seasons, seem to have no trouble understanding him at all. This inconsistency is one of the more discussed mysteries among longtime fans, and the show has never settled on a definitive answer, because settling on one would require sacrificing either a category of comedic possibility or a different one. But the mysteries that run deeper than the question of who can hear Stewie are the ones that took the show nearly 20 seasons to even partially address. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, is the accent itself. Stewie's parents are both from Rhode Island. Peter's accent is a very specific working-class New England sound, immediately and geographically identifiable. Lois speaks with the kind of accent associated with a certain type of American East Coast upper-middle-class background, which fits with the backstory of her coming from a wealthy family. Neither of them sounds remotely British. None of the other Griffin children have any trace of a British accent. Stewie has spoken with unmistakably refined British inflection in every single episode since the show's first season. For 19 years, nobody ever explained why. In the episode Send in Stewie, Please, which aired on the 18th of March 2018, as the 12th episode of the 16th season and the 301st episode of the series overall, the show finally offered an explanation. The episode was co-written by Gary Janetti, one of the show's most accomplished writers who has a particular sensitivity to Stewie's character, and it featured a two-character structure that was essentially unprecedented for the series. For almost the entire runtime of the episode, it was just Stewie and a therapist, played with considerable elegance by Ian McKellen, sitting in a room talking. No cutaway gags, no B-plot, no broader family chaos. Just two characters having real, unguarded conversations about who Stewie actually is, underneath the performance he gives to the world every day. And what the episode revealed was startling in its simplicity. The British accent is fake. Stewie, sitting across from a therapist who has created enough of a sense of safety for genuine confession to feel possible, breaks character. He speaks in what turns out to be his actual voice. And his actual voice sounds, in a moment that is both comedic and genuinely moving, more like Peter than like any British aristocrat. It is a flat American voice, a Rhode Island voice, the voice of a child who grew up in the same geographic and cultural context as his parents. The British accent, Stewie explains, is armor. It is something he constructed because it makes him feel special. It puts a layer of performance between himself and the world, a layer that he controls, that makes the gap between who he is and who he fears he might be if he were not performing seem less dangerous. The accent is not an accident of birth or a quirk of genetics. It is a choice, a defense mechanism, a way of being in the world that keeps the real Stewie at a safe distance from judgment. When the therapist, gently but directly, points out that if Stewie dropped the accent, he would simply be a boy like any other boy, Stewie's response is immediate. He snaps the accent back into place. The revelation is made and then immediately sealed away behind the performance again. But the fact of it lingers. Every time you watch an episode with Stewie after seeing that one, there is a different quality to the way his voice lands. You know it is a choice. You know the person inside the performance. The armor becomes visible in a way it was not before. The therapist episode also addressed the other great Stewie mystery, the one that fans had been speculating about since early in the show's run. For years, jokes about Stewie's sexuality were a consistent and escalating presence in the show. From early hints about cross-dressing preferences to full scenes involving his apparent attraction to other male characters, the show spent nearly 2 decades generating comedy from the ambiguity of a 1-year-old baby's orientation without ever actually committing to an answer. Different writers had different opinions. Different seasons leaned in different directions. And a specific episode that would have resolved the question, tentatively titled Queer is Stewie, was developed for what would have been Season 4 and then shelved before it ever made it to air. That scrapped episode, as it was described in materials that eventually circulated among fans, would have had Stewie come out as gay following a near-death experience, only to be shunned by his family and eventually travel back in time to remove a biblical passage from Scripture. It was an ambitious and potentially very funny concept. It was also apparently considered too definitive. The ambiguity itself was valuable to the writers. The uncertainty about Stewie's sexuality was a renewable comedic and narrative resource in a way that a clear answer would not have been. Once you define it, you lose the particular energy that comes from not knowing. So the episode was shelved, and Stewie continued to be ambiguous for a dozen more seasons before the therapist episode finally addressed it. What the therapist episode revealed, in addition to the accent secret, was that Stewie does not experience his sexuality as a resolved or settled thing. He is fluid, he suggests, in the way he experiences attraction. But the manner in which he discusses this is hedged and uncertain and circling. Not the language of someone arriving at a confident conclusion, but the language of someone beginning to understand that the question is more complicated than they previously thought. Writer Gary Janetti explained at the time that the intention was not to create a definitive answer, but to mark the beginning of Stewie's engagement with the question. His awareness of his own sexuality is, as Janetti put it, something that needs to stay uncertain, because the uncertainty is part of who Stewie is at this stage of his development. That framing makes sense for the character. But it also means that the mystery, while partially addressed, remains genuinely open. What we know now is that Stewie is aware that his orientation is not simple, and that he is in the early stages of understanding rather than in possession of a clear answer. What we do not know is where that understanding leads. The show has continued since the therapist episode without substantially advancing or revisiting those questions in any sustained way, which means Stewie's inner life remains, in important ways, a mystery that was briefly illuminated and then returned to its usual state of productive ambiguity. There is one more Stewie mystery that deserves its own quiet moment of consideration, because it gets at something fundamental about how the show uses this character and what that usage implies. The original Stewie, the evil genius baby who plotted world domination and tried consistently and with considerable creativity to kill his mother, operated in a space where his extraordinary intellect and his equally extraordinary violence were the core of his character. He built weapons in his nursery. He constructed machines of impressive sophistication. He made attempts on Lois's life with a regularity and an inventiveness that the show treated as one of its most reliable comedy engines. The show retired that version of Stewie slowly enough that many viewers did not notice the change was happening until it was essentially complete. By the time you reach season 8 or so, the evil baby who wanted to kill his mother and conquer the world has been almost entirely replaced by a character defined primarily by his insecurities, his friendship with Brian, and his emerging questions about identity. It is a different character wearing the same clothes. The mystery is not whether this change happened. It clearly did. The mystery is where the original Stewie went. The show offered an answer, of sorts, in the season 6 two-part episode where Stewie finally achieved his goal of killing Lois and taking over the world, only for the entire thing to be revealed as a simulation. The implication of that twist was that the evil genius plots were always, on some level, fantasy, that the world domination schemes and the matricide attempts were a kind of performance, not dissimilar from the British accent, something Stewie did because it was expected of him, rather than because it was authentically who he was. That reading makes the revelation in the therapist episode even more interesting in retrospect. If the evil baby was always a performance, then the accent is not the only armor Stewie has been wearing. The whole identity was armor. The genius, the villainy, the world-conquering ambition, all of it might have been a way of not being something simpler and more vulnerable. The kid underneath all those performances is the one who sounds like Peter and is uncertain about who he is attracted to, and feels scared that without the character he has constructed, he might not be special at all. It is a genuinely complex reading for a character who started out as a 1-year-old with a laser gun. And the fact that the show embedded enough in Stewie over the years to support that reading says something significant about the depth that was always available in these characters, even when the surface was mostly jokes. Section 6, Meg's Hidden Truth. Meg Griffin is the Griffin family's oldest child, and she might be the character the show has treated most inconsistently across its entire run. We talked about what happened to her in terms of the show's treatment of her as a target of increasingly extreme abuse. But underneath all of that, there are mysteries about Meg that the show planted and then never quite resolved, and some of them are considerably darker than the comedy suggests. The most significant and most discussed involves the question of who Meg's father actually is. In the 3rd season episode Screwed the Pooch, there is a scene where Brian is demonstrating his knowledge of the Griffin family by finishing Peter's sentences and providing facts about the children that Peter himself does not know. He mentions Chris's favorite ice cream flavor. He mentions Stewie's preferred bedtime story. And then he mentions, matter-of-factly, in the middle of this parade of family trivia, that Meg's real father is a man named Stan Thompson. Meg is wearing headphones at the time. She does not hear this. The audience hears it. And then the show moves on as if nothing particularly significant has been said. Stan Thompson. A name dropped once, in a scene that plays primarily as a demonstration of Brian's observational intelligence, rather than as a major character revelation. But if taken at face value, the implication is substantial. Meg is not Peter's biological daughter. She was conceived in a relationship between Lois and this Stan Thompson person before Lois and Peter settled into their marriage, or at least before Meg was born. And the parentage was never disclosed to Meg or apparently to Peter in any way that has been shown on screen. Peter's behavior toward Meg, which grows considerably more cruel as the show progresses, takes on a different quality when filtered through this possibility. Whether or not Peter consciously knows that Meg is not his biological daughter, the theory is that his treatment of her reflects an unconscious or semi-conscious awareness of her otherness within the family unit, a sense that she does not entirely belong the way Chris and Stewie do. The show has returned to this territory in various ways, most of them played for comedy rather than for genuine character exploration. There are multiple gags across different seasons about Meg's birth being uncertain or contested in various ways. Her birth certificate has been joked about being changed. Flashbacks to her birth have appeared in various episodes with inconsistent details. Peter has been shown considering, in cutaway form, what it would look like if he had left Meg with Stan Thompson rather than raising her. But the show has never gone back to that Brian scene in Screwed the Pooch, and genuinely reckoned with what it means. Stan Thompson is not a character who appears on screen in any meaningful way in the main canon of the show. The information Brian provides is allowed to sit in the series' history. acknowledged by fans and by people who pay close attention to the show's internal mythology, without ever being fully integrated into the story the show tells about this family. What makes this particularly interesting is how it intersects with another layer of uncertainty in Meg's history: the voice. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg in the first season. Mila Kunis voiced her from the second season onward. This transition happened during a period when the character was still being established, when the specific qualities that would come to define Meg, her longing for acceptance, her capacity for endurance, the specific quality of her suffering and her occasional resistance to it, were still being worked out. The Meg that Chabert voiced is a slightly different character than the Meg that Kunis built over the following 2 decades, not unrecognizable, but operating with a different emotional register. There is also the matter of Meg's age, which the show has handled with the same floating chronological logic it applies to most things. Meg is consistently described as a teenager, as a student at James Woods Regional High School, as someone who is 17 or 16 depending on the episode. But the show has been running since 1999, which would make Meg, if time passed in any realistic sense, somewhere in her 30s or 40s now. The show's refusal to let its characters age in any meaningful way means that Meg is perpetually the teenager, perpetually at the stage of development where the need for parental approval and peer acceptance is most acute, perpetually in the situation where the abuse she receives is most developmentally damaging. That perpetual adolescence is part of what makes the show's treatment of her feel, at its worst moments, so disturbing. She is not going to grow out of it. She is not going to leave home and build a life where these relationships are behind her. She is going to remain in the position of the teenager whose family treats her with contempt, indefinitely, in a world where time does not move forward enough to offer her an exit. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 briefly offered what felt like the beginning of an answer to this. Meg confronting her family, laying out the specific ways their treatment of her has been harmful, watching them fall apart without their shared target, and then choosing to return to her role as the punching bag because the alternative, a family turning on itself, was worse in a different way. The episode suggested that Meg understands her function in the family and accepts it not out of weakness but out of a kind of love for something she recognizes as broken but still hers. That reading makes Meg considerably more tragic and considerably more complex than the comedy of her abuse usually allows. She is not simply being victimized. She is, in some sense, choosing her victimization because the alternative is the destruction of something she values even in its damaged state. Whether or not the writers intended that depth to be present is genuinely unclear. The episode is divisive among fans partly because it is hard to know whether you are watching something being treated with genuine sensitivity or something being used one more time to generate discomfort for comedic purposes. Both readings are supportable from the text. The ambiguity is characteristic of the show at its most interesting and its most irresponsible simultaneously. What remains true is that Meg's deepest questions, who her father really is, what it means that she stays in a family that treats her the way they do, what the show ultimately wants to say about a character who has been both its most abused creation and its most genuinely human one, have never been fully answered. The clues are there. The material is there. The character is there. But the resolution has been deferred across 25 years in favor of something easier. Meg is the mystery the show keeps choosing not to solve. Section 7. Brian Griffin's Unsolved Mysteries. Brian Edward Griffin. White Labrador. Age 10 in dog years. Failed novelist. Recovering aspirant intellectual. Former voice of reason turned wildly inconsistent moral agent. The character most directly based on Seth MacFarlane's own sensibility and in some ways the most complicated mystery in the show's internal mythology. Brian's backstory, as the show has laid it out over the years, involves being born on a farm in Austin, Texas, in a litter of 5 puppies. His mother was named Biscuit. His father was a guard dog named Coco. The family that owned them were farmers. At some point in Brian's early life, his mother was sold. He was abandoned, he became a stray, and then Peter Griffin found him on the street and brought him home. That is the official version, the simple version, the version the show returns to when it needs Brian to have an origin it can reference. But there is a fan theory, developed through careful attention to details scattered across both Family Guy and its sibling series American Dad, that suggests something considerably stranger about what Brian actually is and why he exists the way he does. The theory runs roughly like this. Brian is almost certainly not simply a naturally occurring dog who happens to have human-level intelligence, human speech, and the ability to drive a car, write fiction, form romantic relationships with humans, and engage in philosophical debate. These are not traits that emerge from conventional biology. They are traits that suggest modification, engineering, intervention of some kind. The theory, drawing on the existence of the CIA and its advanced scientific operations as they are depicted in American Dad, suggests that Brian may be a classified government experiment in cross-species cognitive enhancement, a dog whose natural intelligence was deliberately elevated to human levels through technology or science that the government would not acknowledge publicly. This would explain, in the theory's framework, why Brian's specific cognitive profile looks the way it does. He is not simply a smart dog. He is a dog whose mind has been rebuilt or augmented to function at human levels. The capacity to speak, to reason abstractly, to develop aesthetic preferences and romantic feelings and literary ambitions, all of it is explained as the product of deliberate scientific intervention rather than happy accident. The theory is not something the show has confirmed. It is a fan construction, assembled from the pattern of details rather than from explicit statement. But the show has also never provided a more satisfying explanation for why Brian is what he is, which creates the kind of explanatory vacuum that theories fill. What makes Brian's mysteries more immediate than abstract theories is the specific set of unanswered questions generated by the events of Season 12. In the episode Life of Brian, the character is struck by a car while playing street hockey with Stewie and Chris outside the Griffin house. He is taken to a veterinary hospital, but his injuries are too severe. He dies on the table. The Griffin family mourns him. Stewie, who has always been the character with the most direct and unguarded emotional connection to Brian, is devastated in a way that goes beyond comedy. The show treats the death with genuine weight. A new dog, Vinny, is brought in, voiced by the late Tony Sirico, in a performance that was specifically noted for its warmth and authenticity. The family begins to adjust. 2 episodes later, Stewie uses a time travel device he has stolen from a past version of himself to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car. He succeeds. Brian is alive. Vinny is gone. Everything returns to normal. But the episode left behind a specific and never addressed mystery. Who was driving the car? The vehicle that killed Brian was never identified. The driver was never shown or named. In the weeks between Life of Brian and Christmas Guy, when Brian was still dead and fans were processing what appeared to be a permanent loss, there was considerable speculation about whether the driver would be revealed as a significant character, perhaps even as a clue to Brian's broader story or a setup for how he might return. The show brought Brian back through time travel instead of through any revelation about the car, which meant the identity of the driver was simply abandoned. It sits there in the show's history, a mystery that was never considered important enough to answer. Someone drove a car that killed one of the show's most important characters, and the show moved on from the death so quickly that the practical questions around it were never addressed. Brian's son Dylan represents another category of unresolved mystery. In a plotline from an earlier season, Brian discovers that he fathered a son with a woman named Tracy during a brief relationship. The son, Dylan, is fully human, not a human-dog hybrid, not a child with any canine characteristics. Simply a young human boy, in every apparent physical and biological sense, whose father is a white Labrador. The show acknowledged the strangeness of this without explaining it. In a series where the rules about animal-human genetics are deliberately flexible, the existence of a fully human son for a dog is played largely for the oddity of the situation rather than as a mystery requiring resolution. But the biological impossibility of it sits at the center of everything the show does with Brian and his paternity, and the show has never offered any framework for understanding how this works within the world's internal logic. Dylan eventually becomes part of a storyline about Brian trying to be a better father than he was in the past, and there are genuinely touching moments in those episodes. But the fundamental question of how a dog and a human woman produced a fully human child remains unanswered and, apparently, unanswerable within the show's own terms. Then there is the question of what Brian actually knows about himself. There is an episode in which Brian has the opportunity to find out where his mother was sold when she left the farm and what became of her afterward. The discovery he makes is genuinely painful. His mother was sold to a family, lived a life as a domestic pet in the conventional sense, and eventually died. He encounters her remains. It is a moment of genuine emotional weight in the show, And MacFarlane's performance in that episode is considered one of the most affecting pieces of voice work in the series. But the episode raises, without answering, questions about what Brian's relationship to his canine origin actually means to him. He spent his early years as a stray. He was rescued by Peter. He has lived as a member of a human family, operating in human society, having human relationships, pursuing human ambitions. His mother lived as a dog, in the conventional sense, and was loved in the way humans love dogs. The gap between those two experiences of the same species is enormous, and the show gestures at that gap in the emotion of that storyline without ever fully exploring what it means for Brian's sense of his own identity. Brian knows he is a dog who lives like a human. He knows his mother lived like a dog. He presumably understands at some level that his existence is not the normal mode of canine experience. What he thinks about all of that, what it means to him when he is alone and not performing the dry, sophisticated persona he uses to move through the world, the show has never told us. That particular interior life remains, like so much in Family Guy, present as a mystery and absent as an answer. Section 8. When the show knew things it shouldn't have known. There is a specific kind of uncanny feeling that comes from watching an old episode of a television show and recognizing something in it that the writers could not possibly have intended as a reference to something that had not yet happened. The Simpsons gets most of the cultural attention when people talk about animated shows predicting the future. But Family Guy has its own history of genuinely strange anticipations of real-world events, and some of them are considerably harder to explain as coincidence than others. The Kevin Spacey moment is perhaps the most widely discussed, because the specificity of the gag makes it particularly difficult to file away as ordinary chance. In the Season 4 episode Don't Make Me Over, Stewie runs through a shopping mall shouting that he has just escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The episode aired in 2005. The joke was written, as MacFarlane has confirmed in interviews, with no specific knowledge of anything related to Kevin Spacey beyond the general comedic use of celebrity names to add a recognizable reference to an absurdist situation. The specific detail of a basement is what makes the gag particularly strange in retrospect. It is an oddly specific kind of confinement to choose, as opposed to any number of other options that would have served the same comedic purpose. In 2017, actor Anthony Rapp came forward with allegations against Kevin Spacey, describing an incident that occurred when Rapp was 14 years old. Other allegations followed. The particular nature of the allegations and the specific dynamics they described gave the Family Guy joke, which had been airing in reruns for 12 years by that point, a retroactive eeriness that the people who wrote it clearly never intended. MacFarlane was explicit that the writers had no inside information, and that the joke was a random selection from the available pool of celebrity names. The randomness of it is, in some ways, more unsettling than a deliberate reference would be. A deliberate reference would have an explanation. The coincidence has none. The Boston Marathon episode is a different kind of prediction, one that carries considerably more weight because of the scale of what it anticipated. In the episode Turban Cowboy, which aired in March of 2013, there is a cutaway gag in which Peter runs over a crowd of people at the Boston Marathon with a car. The gag is brief, absurdist in the way that most Family Guy cutaway gags are absurdist, designed to be shocking in the specific, controlled way that comedy uses shock as a tool. Approximately 1 month later, on the 15th of April, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring several hundred others. The episode that contained the marathon gag was immediately pulled from circulation. Fox suspended it from television reruns and streaming services. The episode did not return to full availability on Hulu until September 2022, nearly a decade after the bombing. Seth MacFarlane publicly expressed regret about the gag in the aftermath of the bombing. The show had made a joke about violence at the Boston Marathon, and a month later, violence at the Boston Marathon was a real and devastating historical event. The timing was, by any measure, catastrophic. What makes this particular coincidence different from the Kevin Spacey gag is the scale of the tragedy it preceded. A celebrity being implicated in misconduct is a very different thing from a coordinated terrorist attack killing and injuring hundreds of people. The weight of the coincidence is proportional to the weight of the event, which is why the Boston Marathon episode is the one that most people cite when they talk about Family Guy going wrong with its predictions. The Robin Williams connection is quieter and sadder. In the Season 9 episode titled Family Guy Viewer Mail Number 2, there is a segment where everything Peter touches turns into Robin Williams. The bit explores what it would be like to have unlimited Robin Williams in your life. And part of the joke is that the relentlessness of Williams's presence eventually becomes overwhelming and Peter wants it to stop. The episode does not treat Williams cruelly, but it does use his energy and exuberance as a comedic concept in ways that might read differently now than they did at the time. Robin Williams died by suicide in August 2014. He had been experiencing worsening health issues, including a condition that was affecting his cognitive function in ways he found profoundly distressing. The episode of Family Guy that featured the Robin Williams concept aired in the United Kingdom on the same day Williams died. The overlap between the episode and the real-world event was a coincidence of scheduling rather than content, but it produced a specific kind of discomfort that fans in the UK who happened to watch it that evening would have experienced in a unique way. The context transforms the content, even when the connection is entirely accidental. The Caitlyn Jenner prediction is one of the most specific the show produced. In the Season 7 episode Meet the Quagmires, Peter travels back in time to 1984 and alters the future. When he returns to the present, various things have changed. Among them, in the altered future, the character Death mentions that Caitlyn Jenner had won the ESPYs. This episode aired years before Caitlyn Jenner's public transition, and at a time when almost no one would have predicted that she would become a significant public figure in the context of gender identity. The ESPY award detail is particularly strange because it mirrors, in a loose way, what actually happened when Jenner received the Arthur Ashe Courage Award at the ESPYs in 2015. The writers have generally attributed these kinds of coincidences to the simple mathematical reality that a show producing vast quantities of material over many years, referencing public figures and contemporary events at an aggressive pace, will occasionally stumble into territory that real events later occupy. When you make enough guesses, some of them are going to be right. The ones that are right get remembered and discussed. The thousands of guesses that were wrong get forgotten. That explanation is logically sound. It is also somewhat unsatisfying in cases where the specificity of the coincidence is high enough to feel like something more than random chance. The ESPY detail, the basement detail, the marathon timing. These are not vague thematic overlaps. They are specific enough that they retain their eerie quality even when the statistical explanation is readily available. There is also the matter of Bitcoin. In a Season 13 episode that aired in 2014, Peter mentions investing in Bitcoin during a conversation about the family's finances. At the time of the episode's original airing, Bitcoin was known but still relatively niche, associated primarily with early adopters and people with specific interests in decentralized currency. It had not achieved the cultural ubiquity and extraordinary value peaks that it would go on to reach in subsequent years. Fans noticed that in the period following the episode's airdate, Bitcoin's value began climbing in ways that positioned it as a mainstream investment consideration rather than an obscure digital curiosity. The causal relationship between a Family Guy joke and Bitcoin's subsequent trajectory is, to be clear, approximately zero. But the coincidence of the timing created a specific cultural moment in which the show was retroactively credited with anticipating a significant financial development. And then there is the COVID-19 adjacent episode. In a Season 16 episode that aired in 2018, storyline elements involving a pandemic and the social and political dynamics that form around it were explored. 4 years later, those dynamics, specifically the debates around public health measures, vaccination, and the political polarization of a disease outbreak, played out in the real world in ways that gave the episode a different resonance than it had in its original context. None of these coincidences prove anything supernatural. They are all explainable, individually, as the natural product of a show that generates enormous quantities of topical content year after year. But collectively, they create a pattern that is difficult to entirely dismiss, and that has made Family Guy's accidental profit moments a persistent part of how the show is discussed in popular culture. The show knows things it should not know. It has for 25 years. And nobody, including the people who make it, has ever been able to explain exactly why. Section 9. The Banned and the Censored. Most of what Family Guy does lives at the edge of what broadcast television will permit and occasionally crosses it. The history of the show is partly a history of negotiation with the network about what can and cannot be shown, spoken, implied, or joked about on primetime television on Fox. That negotiation has produced a specific collection of episodes and scenes that were cut, altered, banned, or simply never aired in their original form, and the story of what those episodes contain tells you as much about the show's character as the episodes that made it through intact. The most famous example is Partial Terms of Endearment. This is the episode, developed for Season 8, in which Lois agrees to serve as a surrogate mother for an old college friend. When the friend and her husband die in an automobile accident, Lois and Peter are left with the question of what to do with the pregnancy. The episode ultimately involves Lois choosing to have an abortion, making it the only episode of Family Guy in which that specific choice is the central narrative event. Fox refused to air it. The network's decision was framed in various ways by different people involved in the conversation. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Riley described it as an extraordinarily fragile subject, one that the network simply did not want to be in the middle of commercially or politically. MacFarlane, for his part, described the episode as being too edgy for the network, which, in context, reads less as agreement with Fox's decision and more as resigned acknowledgement of the commercial and political realities that governed the decision. The episode was eventually released on DVD and performed live for an audience before the DVD release, which allowed fans to experience it outside the context of broadcast television. But it has never aired on Fox, and for a show that has spent 25 years pushing aggressively at the limits of what broadcast television will permit, the fact that this specific episode crossed a line that the network would not allow represents a meaningful boundary in the show's history. The abortion episode is the only one that was banned entirely before it was ever broadcast, but it is not the only episode that was pulled from circulation after having aired. Turban Cowboy, which we discussed in the context of its inadvertent anticipation of the Boston Marathon bombing, represents the other end of the spectrum. An episode that aired, was well received in its original context, and then became retroactively problematic because of events that occurred after it was broadcast. The episode was pulled from streaming and reruns after the April 2013 bombing. It spent nearly a decade in limbo before returning to full availability. The specific cutaway involving the marathon violence was not only dark in the way that most Family Guy dark content is dark, it was dark in a way that events in the real world made unbearable to watch in its original framing. MacFarlane has spoken about his own feelings about the episode with what sounds like genuine discomfort, which is notable for a creator who has generally defended his show's right to make jokes about sensitive and controversial subjects. The history of individual scenes and gags that were cut from episodes is considerably more extensive than the history of banned episodes, and it extends across the entire run of the show. In the very first season, content was cut from episodes for reasons ranging from sensitivity around religious imagery to specific jokes that were considered inappropriate even for a show that was already operating at the edge of broadcast standards. The Kennedy assassination JFK Pez dispenser gag, which appeared in a Season 1 episode and involved a boy demonstrating how the dispenser worked, was cut from Fox airings because the specific nature of the joke about how Kennedy's head moved was deemed too disturbing for broadcast. The Venezuela situation is one of the stranger chapters in the show's censorship history. When the Season 7 episode 420, which involves Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana, aired, the Venezuelan government took exception. The government's justice minister cited the episode as an example of American media promoting drug use to younger audiences, and cable stations in Venezuela were warned that they faced fines if they continued to air Family Guy. The ban effectively removed the show from Venezuelan broadcast. Getting banned by a sovereign government is not something that happens to most American primetime comedies. Family Guy has managed it twice, once in Venezuela and once in a more limited way through the specific episode that crossed a line for Venezuelan regulators. There are also the unaired scenes that exist in the show's history not because they were cut for content, but because they became untimely in ways nobody anticipated. The Road to Rhode Island episode contained a gag involving Osama bin Laden at airport security that was present in the original broadcast version of the episode. When the DVD version was assembled after the 11th of September 2001, the gag was removed. The gap between when the joke was written and when it would have been encountered by new audiences had changed the context entirely. The censorship history of the show on streaming platforms, particularly Disney Plus, adds another layer to this story. When Family Guy was added to the Disney Plus library, the platform's content standards, which are generally calibrated for a much broader and younger audience than Family Guy's typical viewership, created friction with a show that has been specifically designed to be inappropriate in various ways. The result was a modified version of the catalog on Disney Plus, with certain episodes absent and certain scenes within available episodes altered in ways that longtime fans noticed and found jarring. The specific changes included edits to episode titles that contained words Disney Plus considered inappropriate, as well as modifications to visual content within episodes. The experience of watching Family Guy on Disney Plus, as it was configured in the early period of the show's presence on that platform, was the experience of watching a show that had been passed through a filter designed for a different audience, and the results illustrated, in a specific and practical way, the inherent tension between the show's identity and the commercial context in which it now existed. This tension between what Family Guy is and what the corporate environment around it would prefer it to be is a version of a tension that has run through the show's entire history, from Fox's initial nervousness about the opening theme song, to the network's refusal to air the abortion episode, to the streaming platform's content adjustments. The show has always been something that the machinery around it was slightly uncomfortable with, even as that machinery profited from it enormously. The scenes and episodes that were cut, altered, or banned are a record of exactly where those boundaries were, season by season. They are the negative space around the show that exists, the outline of what Family Guy wanted to be that the network, the regulators, and the corporate parents would not allow. Section 10. Hidden in plain sight. There is a particular pleasure in discovering something that has been in front of you the whole time. Family Guy, whatever else you might say about it, has been exceptionally generous to viewers who pay close attention. The show has, across its entire run, embedded details in backgrounds, in throwaway moments, in visual gags that only make sense if you pause the footage, that reward the kind of obsessive, frame-by-frame attention that was impossible to give it when it was airing live, but became entirely possible once home video and streaming created the conditions for that kind of close examination. The most elegant of these hidden details is in the opening credits sequence, specifically in the shot of Lois playing piano in the living room. If you look at the sheet music sitting on the piano in front of her during that sequence, and if you are watching on a screen with enough resolution to make out the actual notes and staff, you will see that the music on the page is the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. She is playing the theme. The music she is performing in the opening credits of Family Guy is the Family Guy theme, and the written music in front of her confirms this for anyone who is close enough and attentive enough to look. It is such a complete and confident joke. It requires no one to ever actually see it to be what it is. The writers knew it was there. The animators who drew it knew it was there. The people who made the show put in the work to make it accurate rather than simply dressing, which would have been entirely invisible to everyone watching, and they did it specifically so that someone, someday, would pause the footage at exactly the right moment and discover it. The Facebook detail is another one in this category. There is an episode in which Lois is using Facebook, and her profile page is visible on screen for a long enough moment that attentive viewers can actually read what is on it. Meg has sent Lois a friend request. The request is pending. Lois has not accepted it. The joke is quiet and completely devastating. In the context of the show's treatment of Meg, the image of her sending her mother a friend request and the mother not having gotten around to accepting it, or having chosen not to, is a microcosm of the entire dynamic between them. It is a single visual detail that contains the entire sadness of one of the show's most consistently abused characters, expressed through the specific social mechanics of a platform that did not exist when the show began, and that brings its own particular flavors of longing and rejection to the situation. The newspaper headline gag from the episode Model Misbehavior is a wonderful example of the show being actively playful with its own audience's habits. In that episode, the Griffin family wins a boat race, and the news coverage includes various newspaper front pages showing their triumph. If you look at the smaller headlines further down on those newspaper pages, one of them reads DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. The show knew that fans would pause their DVDs specifically to look for hidden jokes in the background. And rather than simply putting a hidden joke there, it put a fake disclaimer about how there was no actual hidden joke and anyone who paused to look would be disappointed, which is itself the hidden joke that makes the whole thing work. It is the show winking at its most devoted viewers, with an awareness of exactly what they do and how they do it. In the episode Brian Does Hollywood, near the end, there is a sequence involving an awards ceremony for adult films. The presenter of the award for Best Original Score in an Adult Film is a recognizable figure from that industry. The nominees for the award include characters who are based on real people who have worked on Family Guy's actual musical content. And alongside those names, on the nominee list for Best Score in an Adult Film is John Williams. The John Williams detail is so deeply buried and so specifically absurd that most people watching the episode would have no reason to notice it unless they were already looking. Williams is the composer behind Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, Indiana Jones, and dozens of other defining pieces of American film music. His name appearing on an awards ballot for adult film scoring is the kind of joke that only lands if you know enough about who he is to understand the specific gap between his reputation and the context he is being placed in. It is a joke for people who are paying attention, written into a detail that most people will never see. The Wilhelm scream, for those unfamiliar, is a specific recording of a man screaming that has been used in Hollywood productions as a kind of recurring audio Easter egg since it was first recorded in the early 1950s. It appears in the original Star Wars films, in Indiana Jones, in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and in hundreds of other movies and television shows. It is the most broadly used sound effect in Hollywood history, and sound designers have been embedding it in their work for decades as a private joke between themselves and anyone who is trained enough to recognize it. Family Guy has used it multiple times across various episodes, usually in scenes involving someone falling or being launched into the air. The hidden message on the wall in the episode where the show pokes fun at its similarities to The Simpsons is easy to miss. In a scene where one of the characters exits through a doorway, if you look at the wall behind the door at the right moment, there is text written on it that reads, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." It is a completely pointless joke, requiring both a specific camera angle and a specific pause point to see it all, and it rewards nothing except the simple pleasure of finding something that has been hidden. There are also the background character continuity details, where fans have tracked the appearance of specific extras across different episodes set in different locations, suggesting a kind of background cast that moves through the world of the show without ever being acknowledged. The recurring background characters are not treated as significant within the show's narrative, but they are consistent enough in their appearances that someone paying close enough attention can track them across seasons and build a kind of biographical picture of people who exist at the edges of the Griffin family story. The sheet music on Lois's piano, the unaccepted friend request, the disappointed DVD pauser joke, the John Williams credit. These details are the show at its most quietly confident, the version of the show that trusts in the audience's capacity for attention and rewards it when it is given. They are also, perhaps, the version of the show that is most worth falling asleep to repeatedly, because each viewing creates the possibility of finding something that was always there but never noticed before. Section 11. The mysteries that were never resolved. Every long-running television show accumulates unanswered questions. Some of them are left open deliberately because the writers intend to return to them and never do. Some of them are the result of early decisions being retconned or ignored as the show evolved. Some of them simply fall through the cracks of a writing process that is generating enormous quantities of material year after year and cannot keep meticulous track of every detail across every previous episode. Family Guy has more of these unresolved threads than almost any other animated comedy, partly because of its length and partly because of its fundamental philosophy about continuity, which has always been relaxed. The show operates on what you could call a floating timeline, where characters do not age, where major events can be forgotten between episodes, where the emotional consequences of significant moments are generally reset to zero by the following week. This approach to storytelling has allowed the show to sustain itself over 25 years without having to deal with the narrative weight that accumulated consequences would impose. But it also means that mysteries are rarely solved, because the kind of storytelling that solves mysteries requires a commitment to continuity that the show has never made. The most fundamental unresolved question is also the one that has been present in the show since its very first season. Who can actually hear Stewie? The show has never committed to a consistent answer. In the early seasons, there was a clearer framework in which the adults mostly could not understand Stewie's sophisticated speech, treating whatever sounds they heard from him as infant vocalizations. Brian was the exception, the one character who could both hear Stewie clearly and engage with him in genuine conversation, which gave their relationship a specific quality of being the only two people in each other's worlds who actually understood each other. But this framework was never rigidly maintained, even in the early seasons. Peter occasionally responded to things Stewie said in ways that implied comprehension. Lois showed awareness of Stewie's communications in specific episodes when the plot required it. And as the show progressed, the general level of adult awareness of Stewie's speech increased to the point where by the middle and later seasons, characters who theoretically could not understand him were responding to him as a matter of course. The show tried to address this in a meta way, producing an episode that explores the question of who can hear Stewie as a direct subject rather than a background ambiguity. The episode raises the question and then declines to fully answer it, which is characteristic of the show's approach to its own most interesting mysteries. The value of the question is greater than the value of an answer would be, so the question remains open. The Griffin family's relationship to Quahog's geography and layout is another source of persistent inconsistency that fans have documented in detail. The location of the Griffin house relative to the Swansons, the Quagmires, the Cleveland Browns, the Drunken Clam, and various other recurring locations in the show has shifted between episodes in ways that cannot be explained by any consistent internal map of the town. Houses are shown as adjacent that were previously shown as separated by multiple blocks. The layout of the Griffin house itself has changed between seasons, with rooms appearing and disappearing and staircases relocating. This matters less than it might seem to because the show has never asked its audience to treat its geography as literal or precise. But it does become relevant when you try to make sense of certain plot logistics, and the inconsistency is pervasive enough that it reflects the show's fundamental approach to its own world-building. Approximate enough to serve the comedy of any given episode, consistent enough to create a sense of place, but never pinned down to a level of specificity that would create constraints on storytelling. The timeline of Peter's work history is another area of persistent inconsistency. Peter worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory in the early seasons before losing that job and eventually coming to work at the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery. The brewery job has been the consistent background to Peter's professional life for most of the show's run, but the specific details of how he got there, what happened to him at various points in between, and what his actual responsibilities at the brewery are, have shifted between episodes in ways that do not resolve into a coherent work history. The question of Stewie's time travel device and its relationship to the show's continuity is one of the more philosophically interesting unresolved mysteries. The time machine has been used across multiple episodes to change the past, prevent deaths, revisit earlier moments in the show's history, and explore alternate versions of events. But the show has never established a consistent set of rules for how time travel works in its universe. The implications of changes made in one episode are rarely carried through to subsequent episodes. Stewie's ability to travel through time, which would theoretically make him the most powerful being in the show's world, is deployed and then set aside with a casualness that suggests the writers are more interested in the comedic possibilities of individual time travel premises than in the philosophical or narrative implications of having a character with that kind of power. There is also the deepest and most unresolved question about the Griffin family as a unit. What the show ultimately believes about whether these people love each other. The early seasons were built on the premise that yes, underneath all the dysfunction and chaos and poor decision-making, the Griffins were a family that genuinely cared about each other. Episodes ended with reconciliations. Peter would realize he had gone too far and would apologize, not just as a narrative necessity but as an expression of the genuine feeling beneath his failings. The family's love for each other was imperfect and often expressed awkwardly, but it was real. As the show progressed, that foundational warmth became harder to locate. The cruelty increased. The accountability decreased. The moments of genuine affection that used to close out episodes became rarer and then nearly absent. And the treatment of Meg, which escalated to a point that many critics found genuinely disturbing, seemed to suggest a show that had abandoned the premise of family love in favor of something less comfortable. But then, occasionally, an episode would produce a moment that felt like the early seasons. A scene between Peter and Lois with genuine tenderness in it. A scene between Stewie and Brian that touched something real. A moment with Meg that allowed her to be a full human being rather than a target. These moments are scattered throughout even the later seasons, and they suggest that the show has not entirely forgotten what it once was. The mystery is whether the show knows what it believes, whether the cruelty and the warmth coexist intentionally as an honest reflection of how real families work, even at their most dysfunctional, or whether the show lost the thread of what it was trying to say about family and has been operating without a coherent position ever since. That might be the deepest unresolved mystery in Family Guy's history. Not a plot question, not a character question, a question about what the show itself thinks and whether it has ever fully known. Section 12. The Legacy, the Future, and What We Still Don't Know. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had secured a renewal deal with its parent company Disney that would take the show through its 27th season into the 2028 to 2029 television season. That would coincide more or less with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years. 30 years of Peter Griffin falling downstairs, Stewie building weapons in his nursery, Brian ordering martinis at the bar, Meg being told to shut up. 30 years of cutaway gags and chicken fights and road trip episodes and musical numbers and moments of genuine comedy alongside moments of genuine discomfort. The show that premiered after Super Bowl 33 in 1999 was a specific thing. It had a specific voice, a specific set of ambitions, and a specific set of characters who were recognizable as the people they would eventually become even when they were still in their earliest, least complicated forms. The show that will mark its 30th anniversary in 2029 is a different thing, shaped by everything that happened in between, by the cancellations and the resurrections, by the departures and the arrivals, by Seth MacFarlane stepping away from the creative wheel and the show continuing under different stewardship, by the controversies and the accidental prophecies and the moments where the comedy pushed so hard against the limits of what was acceptable that it crossed them and had to be pulled back. Both of those things, the 1999 show and the 2029 show, are Family Guy. They share the same characters, the same setting, the same title sequence, but they are the products of different moments, different priorities, different understandings of what the show is for and what it owes its audience. MacFarlane's 2024 description of why the show continues is worth sitting with one more time. He said he did not see a good reason to stop. People still love it. It makes them happy. And as long as the numbers did not show people simply ceasing to care, the show would continue. He framed it in terms of utility and audience demand rather than creative necessity. The show continues because it can and because the business case remains viable, not because its creator is burning to tell stories that can only be told through these particular characters in this particular world. That is an honest answer. It is also a somewhat melancholy one. If you hold it against what the show's original creative energy felt like in those first 3 seasons, when MacFarlane was deeply invested in every detail and the characters were still fresh enough to surprise him. The mysteries we have explored throughout this journey, Stewie's accent, Meg's paternity, Brian's nature, the accidental predictions, the banned episodes, the hidden details, the unresolved questions about who these people are and what the show ultimately believes about them will mostly remain mysteries. The show has demonstrated, across 25 years, that it is more interested in the questions than in the answers. It is more comfortable leaving things open than closing them, and there is a valid creative argument for that approach. A show that resolves all its mysteries stops being a show that generates curiosity and engagement and becomes simply a completed story. But there is also something slightly wistful about sitting with all of these open questions after spending this much time with them. The British accent that is really just armor. The father whose name was dropped once and never revisited. The car that killed Brian that had no driver the show was willing to name. The evil genius who became someone gentler and was never explained. The woman whose friend request sits pending on her mother's Facebook page. These are not just unanswered questions about a cartoon family. They are the specific ways in which the show gestures at something real. At the particular loneliness of people who want to be known but perform instead of revealing themselves. At the complicated mathematics of family, where belonging and rejection are often closer together than anyone wants to admit. At the strange experience of loving something even when it does not treat you well. At the way that time and distance and the accumulation of seasons can change something so gradually that you barely notice it happening until you look back and realize how far you have come from where you started. Family Guy has been on television long enough to contain multitudes. Long enough to have made mistakes and occasionally tried to correct them. Long enough to have found moments of genuine beauty in the middle of all the chaos and the noise. Long enough for the characters to feel, to the people who have grown up watching them, like something approaching real. The secrets and mysteries we have spent this time exploring are part of what makes the show feel that way. Real things have hidden layers. Real people are not fully knowable, even to the people who are closest to them. Real families are built on things that are never quite said and questions that are never quite asked. Family Guy, at its strangest and most unexplained, is at its most honest about all of that. There are things about this show that will never be explained. Who drove the car? Whether Meg was ever really Peter's? What Stewie would have become if the writers had kept him dangerous? What Brian knows about himself that he has never told anyone? These questions will sit in the show's history for as long as it airs, and probably for years after it eventually ends, sustaining the particular kind of engagement that only unresolved mysteries can maintain. The show is renewed through 2029. The characters are not aging. The questions are not being answered. And somewhere in the world right now, someone is falling asleep to an episode they have seen 40 times. In the comfortable dark, barely listening, just letting the familiar voices fill the space where the day used to be. That person might not know about the sheet music on Lois's piano. They might not know that Stewie's accent is armor, or that Brian almost sounded like William H. Macy, or that the man who created all of them missed a flight by 10 minutes that changed the course of his life and, as a side effect, the history of television comedy. They might not know that somewhere in the show's history there is an episode about abortion that has never aired on American television, or that the Boston Marathon gag was pulled from streaming for nearly a decade, or that a cutaway about Kevin Spacey's basement was not a secret that the writers were keeping, but a coincidence that the world was not ready for yet. All of that is there, hidden in the show, in its history, in the spaces between what it says and what it means, waiting for whoever is paying close enough attention. And now that you know, every rewatch is going to feel a little different, a little richer, a little more layered, because knowing the secrets changes how you hear the familiar things. That is what these mysteries do. They do not take the comfort out of the familiar. They add something to it. They make the show you thought you knew into something slightly stranger and more interesting than you realized. Sleep well. And the next time the theme song starts, notice what Lois is actually playing. If you made it this far, you have spent a long time in the world of the Griffins, and I hope it was worth it. Drop a comment and let me know which secret hit you the hardest, or which mystery you most want to see the show actually answer before it reaches that 30th anniversary. And if you are new here, please subscribe. It genuinely helps, and it means that the next time we do something like this, more people get to be part of it. Until next time, stay curious, stay comfortable, and sleep easy. Extended section. The writing room and the voices behind the show. To truly understand Family Guy, you have to understand what it is like to be inside the room where it gets made. The writing room of an animated series is one of the stranger professional environments in American entertainment. It is part creative workshop, part philosophical debating society, part group therapy session, and part comedy club where the audience consists exclusively of the people trying to make each other laugh. The rhythms of that room, who talks the most, who has the best instincts for what will land on screen, who can take a mediocre premise and find the angle that makes it genuinely funny, determine the character of the show in ways that are invisible to most viewers, but completely decisive for what the show becomes. In Family Guy's earliest seasons, that room was shaped by Seth MacFarlane's specific sensibility in ways that gave the output a coherent voice. MacFarlane was not a passive presence in the writing process. He was deeply engaged with the specific jokes and specific directions the stories took, bringing his own aesthetic judgments to bear on everything that was being developed. When his sensibility was the dominant force in the room, the show reflected a specific set of values about what comedy could do and how far it could push before it stopped being comedy and started being something else. The writers who surrounded him in those first seasons each brought their own histories and their own comedic instincts. Gary Janetti, who would go on to become one of the show's most consistently excellent contributors and who eventually wrote the therapist episode that was one of the show's most ambitious single episodes, had a specific quality of emotional intelligence that informed his best work on the show. Danny Smith brought a particular kind of blue-collar comedy sensibility that suited the working-class dynamics of the Griffin family. Chris Sheridan understood the specific rhythm of the show's dark humor in ways that kept it from going further than was useful. Together, this group found what the show was. They established it not through a single decisive conversation about what Family Guy would be, but through the cumulative process of writing it, episode by episode, discovering in the doing what worked and what did not, what felt true to the characters and what felt imposed on them from outside. The 3-year cancellation gap that followed the show's original broadcast run broke this collaborative infrastructure. Writers dispersed to other projects. The specific shared understanding that had been built across 3 seasons of working together was not something that could be fully preserved or reconstituted once the people who held it were separated and went their different ways. When the show came back in 2005, the writing room was different. Not worse in every respect, but different in the specific way that matters when you are trying to continue a creative project that was built on a very particular shared sensibility. New writers brought new instincts. Some of those instincts aligned well with what the show had been. Others pushed in directions that represented genuine departures from the original tone. The gradual changes that fans of the early seasons observed in the revival seasons and beyond were not the result of any single decision or any single person's influence. They were the natural accumulation of many different creative voices, contributing to a project that no longer had its original center of gravity, enforcing a consistent standard. Seth MacFarlane's gradual withdrawal from active creative involvement in the show, which appears to have begun in earnest around 2010 or 2011, as his film and television work outside Family Guy demanded more of his time and attention, accelerated this drift. When the creator of a show is present in the room, his taste functions as a corrective, a reference point for everyone else in the room about what the show is supposed to be. When he is absent, that reference point disappears and the room has to find its own standard, which is not always the same standard. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over day-to-day show-running responsibilities from MacFarlane, were experienced writers who knew Family Guy's world deeply. They had been in the room during important periods of the show's development, but there is a difference between knowing a show from inside the process of making it and having the specific creative vision that gives the process its direction, and Appel and Sulkin's show-running era, whatever its genuine strengths, was always working in the shadow of the original vision, rather than generating its own. The question of who the show is for, which the original seasons answered implicitly through the consistency of their voice, became a more complicated one in the revival seasons and beyond. Family Guy had always been for adults who appreciated comedy that was willing to go further than network television typically went. But what kind of adult? With what sensibilities? With what appetite for specific kinds of darkness? The original seasons had a clear answer that came from MacFarlane's specific background and specific taste. The later seasons had many possible answers depending on which writers were working on which episodes. This multiplicity is both a strength and a weakness. A show that reflects many different voices can find angles and approaches that a single dominant sensibility would miss. But it can also lose the coherence that makes a specific voice feel like it belongs to someone real. Extended section: The Griffin House and its Secrets. There is something you can do if you have access to a television and a pause button and a few hours of patience. Watch every episode of Family Guy in which the interior of the Griffin House is shown and map it. What you will discover, if you do this, is that the Griffin House is a building that does not obey the normal rules of architecture. Rooms appear that had not previously been established. The staircase changes direction between episodes. The kitchen sometimes has a door to the backyard and sometimes does not. The living room has been both larger and smaller at different points in the show's history, accommodating more or fewer pieces of furniture as the needs of specific scenes require. This is not a deficiency of the show so much as a deliberate feature of how it approaches its own world. Family Guy has never asked its audience to treat the Griffin House as a literal physical structure that exists consistently across time. It has asked its audience to recognize the visual shorthand of the space, to know that the couch is in the living room and the kitchen is nearby, and there are stairs going up to the bedrooms, and to bring those recognitions to bear on whatever scene they are currently watching without expecting them to add up to a coherent floor plan. The Griffin's backyard has been particularly inconsistent. In some episodes, it is a simple small yard with a fence. In others, it opens onto a much larger space. The relationship between the Griffin house and the neighbors' houses has shifted. The specific arrangement of the neighborhood, which houses are adjacent to which other houses, and how far it is from one location to another, has changed enough across seasons that any attempt to draw a map of the neighborhood would require multiple contradictory versions. What stays constant is the feeling of the spaces. The Griffin living room, whatever its exact dimensions, has a specific quality of comfortable, slightly worn domesticity that communicates something true about the family who inhabits it. The kitchen is the kitchen. The bedrooms are the bedrooms. The Drunken Clam Bar has a specific quality of working-class comfort that communicates its own truth about the kind of place it is and the kind of people who spend time there. These feelings are consistent in ways that the specific details are not. And this is perhaps the more honest account of how any of us actually experience the spaces we inhabit. The layout of a familiar room is less precisely mapped in memory than the feeling of being in it. Family Guy, whatever its inconsistencies with interior design, is consistent in this more fundamental sense. The specific objects that have persisted across the show's entire run are worth noting as another category of hidden detail. The specific arrangement of items on the walls of the Griffin living room, the specific placement of objects on the kitchen counter, these have been referenced and re-referenced across seasons in ways that create a specific kind of visual continuity, even when the space itself is shifting around them. The writers and animators know that certain objects belong in certain places and have maintained that knowledge, even as other aspects of the space have been allowed to change. The objects in Stewie's bedroom are particularly consistent and particularly revealing. The specific toys and books that have been present in his room across many seasons tell a story about his character that the dialogue rarely addresses directly. The books are too sophisticated for a one-year-old. The equipment, on close inspection, includes items that are not commercially available as nursery decorations. The bedroom is the most honest space in the house, because it has been built to reflect its occupant rather than to serve the plot needs of any specific scene. Extended section. The chicken fight deep history. Among the show's most beloved recurring elements, the extended fight sequences between Peter Griffin and the giant chicken named Ernie are one of the most technically accomplished and the most thoroughly documented. These sequences, which have appeared at irregular intervals across many seasons of the show, are elaborate action pieces that function as comedic spectacles rather than as plot-driven events. The specific quality of comedy they generate comes from the gap between the escalating scale and cinematic ambition of the choreography and the complete inexplicability of the grudge that drives it. The first chicken fight, which appeared in the second season episode Da Boom, established the specific rhythm that all subsequent encounters would follow. Peter and Ernie encounter each other. They begin to fight. The fight escalates through increasingly elaborate and improbable stages, moving through multiple locations and involving escalating levels of physical destruction. The fight eventually ends in a way that appears conclusive but turns out not to be, because Ernie survives and the grudge persists. The origin of the grudge is addressed in the first episode. Ernie gave Peter a coupon for a restaurant that turned out to be expired. Peter was embarrassed. The grudge was formed. The proportionality between this trivial slight and the subsequent years of catastrophically destructive combat is the joke. It is a single comedic premise executed at escalating scale across many years of episodes. What distinguishes the chicken fights from other recurring elements of the show is the level of animation effort that goes into them. The production team treats these sequences as action set pieces in a way that is unusual for a television animated comedy, storyboarding and animating them with a care and detail that most scenes in the show do not receive. The specific moves and counter-moves and environmental interactions within each fight have been carefully planned and choreographed in ways that reward close attention from viewers who watch animated action with the kind of analytical eye that the sequences deserve. The fights have also evolved across their appearances. The early fight was relatively contained in terms of scale and duration. Later fights became longer and more elaborate, incorporating more locations, more environmental destruction, and more callbacks to specific moments from previous fights. The relationship between the chicken and Peter has developed over the course of these encounters in the specific way that a long-running antagonistic relationship develops, shaped by the accumulation of shared history that only people who have been fighting each other for years can have. There is also a question about what Ernie is, specifically. He is a giant chicken. He wears human clothes. He works at a restaurant. He has what appears to be a family and a domestic life. He exists in the world of Quahog with the same matter-of-fact presence as any other character, treated as part of the world's established reality rather than as something that requires explanation. His size, his species, his capacity for human social functioning, none of these are addressed or explained. He is simply Ernie the giant chicken, and the show has always treated his existence as self-evidently acceptable in the terms of the world it has constructed. The specific violence of the chicken fights, which is elaborate and sustained and quite destructive in terms of the environmental damage it causes, has generated its own category of fan analysis. The fighting techniques that Peter and Ernie use against each other have been cataloged and analyzed for their cinematic references, with specific moves appearing to draw on martial arts films and action cinema traditions in ways that suggest the people animating these sequences are bringing outside influences to bear on the choreography. Whether this is a deliberate homage or simply the natural consequence of animators who have absorbed a lot of action cinema, bringing that knowledge to their work, is not something the show has addressed, but the references are visible to viewers familiar with the source material. Extended section. The music of Family Guy. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of Family Guy's creative achievement is its music. The show has always had an unusually ambitious musical dimension for an animated comedy, incorporating original songs, elaborate musical set pieces, and the specific kind of musical joke that requires genuine musical sophistication to execute. Walter Murphy composed the original theme for the show, the brief instrumental fanfare that opens each episode and establishes the specific tonal quality of what you are about to watch. Murphy had a background in jazz and pop orchestration that gave him the specific tools to produce something that sounded simultaneously familiar and distinctive, drawing on the conventions of mid-century American popular music to create a theme that felt warm and slightly comedic and completely appropriate for the specific world the show had built. The show's original music supervisor, Ron Jones, who worked with the production during the early seasons, brought a specific approach to the show's incidental music that was more ambitious than most animated comedies employed. Jones used orchestra-sized ensembles and genuine compositional complexity to score the show's emotional moments, treating them with a seriousness that the comedy itself did not always support, but that gave the best scenes a depth they would not have had with more conventional animated comedy scoring. The musical numbers, which Family Guy has produced across its entire run in quantities that would be remarkable for a straight dramatic show and are genuinely unusual for a comedy, have been another dimension of the show's musical ambition. Seth MacFarlane, who is himself a genuinely accomplished singer with an extensive training in the American songbook tradition, has treated the show's musical moments as opportunities for genuine performance rather than as comedic novelties. The specific quality of care that MacFarlane brings to singing as a vocalist, the attention to phrasing and tone, and the specific emotional communication that singing allows, is visible in the musical numbers that he performs, and it elevates those moments in ways that would not be possible with a voice actor who treated singing as simply another mode of character delivery. The specific songs that the show has produced over the years include both original compositions and adaptations of existing material. The original songs are written with genuine craft, often functioning as parody of specific musical genres or traditions, while also working as actual examples of those genres done competently. A song that parodies Broadway show tunes has to be a competent show tune in order for the parody to work, which requires the people writing it to understand what they are parodying well enough to replicate its specific qualities before subverting them. The show's musical library has become, over 25 years, one of the more extensive collections of original songs produced by any animated television comedy. The songs are not all of equal quality, and the later seasons have not always maintained the specific musical ambition of the earlier ones, but the collection as a whole represents a creative achievement that deserves more recognition than it typically receives in discussions of what the show has produced. Extended section. Quagmire and the characters who surround the Griffins. Glenn Quagmire is the character who has received the least consistent critical evaluation across the show's history, shifting from being one of the show's most beloved supporting cast members in the early seasons to being one of its most debated figures, as the cultural conversation around the specific type of behavior he represents has changed significantly. In the early seasons, Quagmire functioned primarily as a specific comedic type, the bachelor friend who is enthusiastic about women in a way that the other characters find simultaneously amusing and slightly exhausting. His catchphrase, which became one of the most recognizable verbal signatures on the show, emerged from this specific comedic persona. He was Peter's friend who was very specifically and openly interested in women in a way that the other male characters were less explicitly so. The later seasons continued this comedic characterization while simultaneously putting it under more scrutiny through the show's own meta-awareness of how the character and his behavior read. The episode in which Quagmire delivers his famous speech about why he hates Brian Griffin is one of the show's more interesting exercises in self-awareness. Using one morally complicated character to accurately critique another morally complicated character in ways that the audience can recognize as honest, while also recognizing that the speaker is hardly a reliable moral authority. Quagmire's own backstory, which the show has provided in fragments across many episodes, is considerably more complicated than his comedic persona suggests. He has a sister whose marriage to an abusive partner becomes a storyline that the show handles with more genuine seriousness than its usual approach to difficult subject matter. He has his own history of emotional complexity around his relationships with women that the show occasionally allows to surface before retreating back to the comedic persona. Joe Swanson, the show's wheelchair-using police officer, represents another category of character whose trajectory across the series is worth examining. In the first season episode that introduced him, Joe was the cool neighbor, the accomplished, confident, physically imposing figure whose disability was one aspect of a fully realized character rather than the defining feature of a comedic type. He was someone Peter was genuinely jealous of, which established that Joe had qualities that deserved admiration rather than simply sympathy. The later seasons transformed Joe's role in the show in ways that moved him from being the character others looked up to toward being a comedic figure whose disability became more prominent as a source of jokes than it had been in the early seasons. This trajectory is one of the more visible examples of the show's broader pattern of flattening its supporting characters over time, reducing the complexity that made them interesting in favor of more immediately accessible comedic handles. Cleveland Brown, who eventually left the show for his own spin-off series before that series was canceled and Cleveland returned to Family Guy, was the peacemaker of Peter's friend group in the early seasons, the character whose calm, measured quality provided a counterbalance to Quagmire's enthusiasms and Joe's law enforcement intensity. His departure for the spin-off changed the dynamic of the friend group in ways that the show managed by gradually reducing the friend group's prominence as a storytelling element, and Cleveland's eventual return was handled in a way that tried to restore some of what had been lost without fully addressing how much time had passed and how much had changed. The broader cast of Quahog, including recurring figures like Tom Tucker, the news anchor, Diane Simmons, his co-anchor whose departure from the show was one of its more genuinely dramatic single-episode events, Herbert, the elderly character whose relationship with Chris is one of the show's most persistently uncomfortable running jokes, and many others, represents a community that the show has built with enough consistency to feel inhabited even when individual characters within it have been used inconsistently. Extended section: The Road to Episodes and What They Reveal. The Road to Episodes, a series of special adventures featuring Brian and Stewie traveling together through space, time, and alternate realities, represent something genuinely unusual in the show's history. A recurring format that has maintained its quality more consistently than almost anything else the show has produced, across multiple decades and substantial changes in the show's overall direction. Road to Rhode Island, which was the first of these episodes and aired in the second season, established the format. Brian and Stewie are together on a journey that takes them far from Quahog, forced to rely on each other in ways that their domestic situation does not usually require. The adventure generates comedy and also generates something else: the specific kind of emotional intimacy that comes from two people who know each other in one context having to discover each other in a different context. What Brian and Stewie find out about each other when they are traveling together, away from the structure of the Griffin household and the specific roles they play within it, is what makes these episodes work. The subsequent Road to episodes have taken the premise in increasingly elaborate directions. Road to Europe in the third season. Road to Rupert in the fifth season, which many fans consider the finest of the format. Road to Germany in the seventh season, which incorporated one of the show's more unusual historical settings. Road to the Multiverse in the eighth season, which used the adventure format to explore alternate universe versions of the show's world in ways that were both funny and slightly philosophical. And many others across subsequent seasons, each one finding a different way to put Brian and Stewie in a situation that forces them to be present to each other. What makes the Road to episodes consistently better than the show's average output is that they have to work as stories in ways that regular episodes do not. The adventure format requires a beginning, a middle, and an end. It requires characters who change in response to what happens to them. It requires emotional stakes that are real within the terms of what the episode has established. All of these requirements push against the show's tendency toward the episodic and the disconnected, toward cutaway gags and random moments rather than sustained narrative. The Brian and Stewie relationship, which the Road 2 format serves so well, is the show's most emotionally rich relationship across its entire history. The dog and the baby who can understand each other in a house where almost no one can fully understand either of them. The odd pairing that developed from the logic of the show's early seasons, where Brian's ability to hear Stewie placed them in a unique relationship that gradually became the show's most affecting friendship. The specific quality of their affection for each other, which includes genuine love expressed in ways that are regularly interrupted by the comedy of how imperfectly they understand each other, despite understanding each other better than anyone else does. The Road to Christmas episode, which involved Stewie using time travel to save Brian's life in the aftermath of his death, worked as well as it did because the emotional stakes of Stewie's grief had been established over more than a decade of episodes showing what Brian meant to him. It was the accumulated history of all the Road 2 adventures, and all the domestic moments, and all the complicated exchanges that made Stewie's decision to risk everything to get Brian back feel genuinely important, rather than simply plot convenient. Extended section: the world building and what it means. Quahog, Rhode Island is a fictional place built on a real foundation. The specific details of New England geography and culture and working-class life that McFarlane drew on to create the town give it a texture that distinguishes it from the generic animated comedy setting. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States, a fact that has generated specific regional cultural attitudes, including a particular combination of pride and distinctiveness and consciousness of being easy to overlook. The working-class communities of New England, with their specific relationship to labor and to tavern culture, and to the particular kind of sports loyalty that bonds people in ways that transcend other social differences, provided McFarlane with material that he drew on specifically, and that gives the show's world a sense of rootedness that the most successful animated comedies share. The Drunken Clam, as the bar where Peter and his friends spend their leisure time, is a setting that works because it is specific rather than generic. It is not simply a bar. It is the kind of bar that exists in a specific social and geographic context, the neighborhood tavern that serves a community of working-class men who return to it regularly, because it is familiar and because the specific combination of cheap beer and undemanding companionship meets a real human need for belonging that more elevated social spaces do not serve. Pawtucket Patriot Ale, the fictional brewery where Peter has worked for most of the show's run, is another piece of specific world-building that grounds the show in a particular cultural reality. Regional craft brewing, which was an increasingly prominent feature of New England economic and cultural life in the period when the show was developed, gives Peter's workplace a specificity that a more generic factory setting would not have. The beer that the brewery produces has a name and a history within the show's internal mythology, which creates the kind of texture that makes a fictional world feel inhabited. The specific cultural references that the show draws on, the 1970s and 1980s American popular culture that Peter in particular consistently recalls and references, connect the show to a specific generational experience. Peter's attachment to television shows and films and music from those decades is not simply nostalgic decoration, but a character detail that grounds him in a particular relationship to American cultural history. He is a person formed by specific cultural experiences, who carries those experiences as a lens through which he processes the present, which is both a comedic device and a recognizable human truth. Extended section: what the show got right. In a narrative of decline and creative compromise, it is worth spending real time with what Family Guy got genuinely right across its history, not just in the early seasons but throughout its run. The show's willingness to engage with genuinely difficult emotional material within its comedic framework is something that has never entirely disappeared, even in its most troubled creative periods. Episodes that could have played entirely for shock or cruelty have occasionally found instead a way to let the emotional reality of what is happening to the characters breathe in ways that the comedy alone would not allow. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, which placed the two characters in a bank vault overnight with no cutaway gags and no external plot, has been consistently identified by fans and critics as one of the finest single episodes the show has produced. It worked not because it abandoned the show's comedic identity, but because it trusted that the characters it had built over 7 seasons had enough genuine depth to sustain a 22-minute conversation without external assistance. Brian's revelation about the gun in his safety deposit box, the acknowledgement of depression and suicidal ideation within a comedic animated series, was handled with a seriousness that the show was not always capable of in its more chaotic episodes. The show's musical set pieces, when they worked, produced something that television animated comedy has rarely matched. The specific combination of McFarlane's genuine vocal talent and the show's willingness to commit fully to a musical number as a primary storytelling vehicle rather than as a gag created episodes and sequences that resonated beyond the comedy. The development of the Brian and Stewie friendship, whatever you think about what happened to each character individually across the show's history, produced one of the more authentic emotional relationships in animated television. The specific quality of two characters who understand each other in a world where almost no one can understand either of them, who rely on each other in ways that go beyond convenience or habit into something that looks like genuine love despite the comedy and the chaos that surround it, is something the show achieved and maintained longer than its critics usually acknowledge. The moments when Meg was treated as a full human being rather than a comedic target, scattered across many seasons but never absent from the show even in its worst periods in that regard, demonstrated that the show knew what it was doing when it did her well. The crossover episode with The Simpsons, in which Lisa Simpson became Meg's friend and helped her find a genuine talent, was not a great moment because of the crossover, but because someone in the writing room understood who Meg was and what she needed, and gave it to her for the duration of that episode. These moments exist throughout the show's history. They are not the show at its average, but they are the show at its best, and the best of Family Guy, scattered across 25 years of television, represents something genuine and worth acknowledging alongside everything that went wrong. Extended section: the show's future and what remains unknown. The renewal that takes Family Guy through 2029 means that the show will mark its 30th anniversary still on the air. 30 years. That is a span of time that encompasses entire human generations, that has seen the children who watched the show in its first years grow into adults who are now watching it with their own children, that has seen the cultural context around the show change so completely that the 1999 version and the 2029 version exist in almost entirely different worlds. The mysteries that remain open after all this time will likely remain open. The show has demonstrated, across its history, that it is more comfortable with questions than with answers, more interested in the space of possibility that an unresolved thread creates than in the specific destination that resolving it would establish. Stewie's sexuality, which was partially addressed and then returned to its productive ambiguity, will probably continue in that state for the duration of the show's run. Meg's biological parentage, planted in the third season and never developed in the following 20-plus seasons, will almost certainly remain an interesting footnote rather than a developed storyline. Brian's true nature, whatever it is, will remain the kind of mystery that generates fan theories and discussion without receiving official confirmation. The question of who can hear Stewie will continue to be answered differently in different episodes depending on what the plot requires. The Griffin House will continue to be slightly different in different episodes, the neighborhood will continue to shift, the timeline will continue to float. What might change, what the renewal through 2029 makes at least possible if not likely, is the specific creative direction of the show's final seasons. Shows that know they are approaching their end sometimes find in that knowledge a mission to take risks that the open-ended continuation logic had prevented. The knowledge that there is a specific horizon can give writers a reason to try to close the questions they have left open, to let the characters arrive somewhere, rather than simply continuing in the comfortable stasis that long-running animation tends to produce. Whether the people making Family Guy in its final seasons will choose to use that possibility is something that cannot be known in advance. What can be known is that the material is there, the questions are there. The characters have been carrying the weight of their unresolved histories for long enough that the stories waiting to be told about those resolutions are some of the most interesting stories available. Meg could find out who her father is. The show could commit to a genuine answer about whether Stewie can be heard and what it means if he can. Brian's relationship to his own nature could be explored in ways that go beyond comedic convenience. The Griffins could arrive, after 30 years, at some version of an honest reckoning with what they are to each other and what they have done to each other. These are things that the show could do. They are not things that it necessarily will do. 25 years of history suggests that the show tends to pull back from the edge of genuine resolution, to retreat to the comfort of the familiar status quo, to allow the reset button to be pushed one more time, rather than letting the consequences of what has happened accumulate into something that would require a real response. But the possibility exists, and the possibility is worth something, in the quiet dark of wherever you are right now. Worth sitting with the idea that after 30 years, the show that has been keeping its secrets and sustaining its mysteries might finally, in its last chapters, choose to tell you what it has known all along. Sleep well. And pay attention to the music on Lois's piano the next time you watch the opening. Further extended section: the animation and its evolution. The visual history of Family Guy is a story of trade-offs between different kinds of quality, each era of the show's animation reflecting different production priorities and different technical capabilities and different ideas about what the show should look like. The original 3 seasons had animation produced by multiple studios, with Rough Draft Studios handling significant portions of seasons 2 and 3. The specific quality that Rough Draft brought to those seasons, a certain scrappy energy and expressiveness, a sense of characters who move in ways that feel responsive and alive rather than mechanically correct, is something that fans of the early show consistently identify as part of what made those episodes feel different. The animation was not the most technically polished work being done in American television animation at the time, but it had a specific vitality that more precise production values might have smoothed away. When the show returned for its 4th season, the animation was produced by different studios under different arrangements, and the visual quality changed in ways that were immediately apparent to viewers who had been following the show closely. The outlines became thicker, and the movements became more constrained, and the overall look of the show became cleaner in a technical sense, while losing some of the expressive range that the earlier animation had possessed. This pattern of technical improvement at the cost of expressive vitality is not unique to Family Guy. It is a common trajectory in long-running animation, where the increasing complexity of the production infrastructure tends to push toward consistency and technical precision at the expense of the more spontaneous quality that early seasons can sometimes achieve, because the constraints that produce consistency have not yet been fully established. The specific studios that handled different portions of the show's animation in seasons 6 and 7, including Digital Emation and Yedem, brought their own visual signatures that were visible to attentive viewers. The character outlines became flatter. The movement became more rigid. Characters occasionally appeared slightly off-model in ways that were subtle enough not to register with casual viewers, but that fans who were paying close attention noticed and commented on. By the later seasons, the animation had settled into a specific look that was consistent and technically accomplished, and completely lacking in the energetic variability that had made the early seasons feel alive. The characters moved correctly. The expressions were clear. The production values were higher by any objective technical measure than they had been in the early seasons. And the animation felt less present, less vivid, less like something made by people who were excited about what they were making, and more like something produced by a well-functioning machine that knew exactly what was expected of it. This evolution in the animation is worth understanding, not as a critique of the technical quality of the work, but as an observation about what visual style communicates about the show's relationship to its own material. Animation that feels alive and responsive tends to suggest a show that is discovering itself, that is still finding out what it is and how it moves. Animation that is consistent and precise tends to suggest a show that knows what it is and is maintaining that knowledge efficiently. The trade between discovery and consistency is real, and Family Guy's animation history traces that trade across 25 years. The specific design choices that have remained constant across the show's animation history are worth noting because they represent the visual language that makes the show recognizable, regardless of which studio is handling production. Peter's specific silhouette, his body shape and his facial features, and the specific way he moves, has remained consistent enough that he is immediately identifiable across very different animation styles. The same is true of the other main characters. These consistent character designs, maintained across multiple studios and many years of production, are the work of the original character designers who established what these people looked like and what the specific rules of their visual identities were. That consistency, which requires active maintenance across the entire production infrastructure, is one of the show's genuine achievements. Whatever else has changed about Family Guy over 25 years, you always know who you are looking at. Further extended section: the cultural impact and what it means. To understand what Family Guy has actually done to American popular culture, you have to think about the specific moment it emerged into and what it changed about what was possible on network television. In 1999, the landscape of animated adult comedy was essentially defined by two shows. The Simpsons had been running for a decade and had established the foundational grammar of the genre, demonstrating that animated comedies could have genuine emotional depth and cultural ambition alongside their comedy. South Park, which had premiered in 1997, had established that animated comedies could be genuinely transgressive in ways that the broadcast limitations of network television made essentially impossible, because the specific flexibility that cable gave the show let it go places that broadcast standards would not allow. Family Guy entered this landscape as a network broadcast show that was trying to do something that The Simpsons had not fully done: to make comedy that was genuinely and aggressively irreverent about everything, that did not respect the implicit hierarchy of what was and was not appropriate to joke about, that used the specific format of the animated family sitcom as a vehicle for jokes that the format had not previously been asked to carry. The cutaway gag format, which Family Guy did not invent, but which it deployed with a specific energy and frequency that made it the show's most distinctive structural feature, changed what network animated comedy could look like. Before Family Guy, animated comedy episodes were generally structured around continuous narratives, stories that unfolded from beginning to middle to end, with jokes emerging from character and situation in the conventional comedy manner. Family Guy demonstrated that you could interrupt those narratives constantly with completely disconnected comedic sequences, and that audiences would follow and enjoy the result. This was not simply a stylistic innovation. It was a change in what television comedy could do, in the implicit contract between a show and its audience about what kind of experience watching a half hour of television was going to be. The audience that watched Family Guy accepted a different kind of contract than the audience watching more conventionally structured comedies, a contract that traded narrative continuity for comedic density, that agreed to accept disconnection in exchange for the specific pleasure of a show that was constantly trying to make you laugh at the highest possible frequency. The influence of this on subsequent animated comedy has been substantial and not always positive. The cutaway format has been imitated and expanded in ways that have sometimes worked brilliantly and sometimes simply demonstrated that the format itself, divorced from the specific comedic intelligence that made Family Guy's use of it effective, produces nothing more than random, disconnected material. The form requires genuine craft to work, requires that the specific jokes inserted via cutaway actually be funny, requires that the selection of what to cut away to and when be made by someone who understands what the scene around the cutaway has established and what kind of comedic departure would be most productive from that foundation. Family Guy at its best understood all of this. The worst cutaway gags in the show's history demonstrate what happens when the format is used as an excuse to insert material without thinking carefully about how it relates to what surrounds it. The best demonstrate what the format can do when it is wielded with precision. The broader cultural impact of the show extends beyond its specific influence on animation. Family Guy's presence on Adult Swim during its revival years was part of a period in which late-night cable animation was establishing itself as a significant cultural force, generating conversations and communities and the specific kind of passionate fan engagement that the internet was making possible in new ways. The show's success on Adult Swim contributed to the legitimacy of that space as a venue for sophisticated adult animation, which in turn made possible the subsequent development of shows that might not have found homes without the precedent that Family Guy and its Adult Swim performance helped establish. The specific communities that formed around Family Guy on early internet platforms, the forums, and the fan sites, and the communities that shared clips and debated episodes and developed the kind of detailed fan mythology that the show's internal secrets and mysteries made possible, were early examples of what participatory fan culture around television could look like when the internet provided the infrastructure for it. Family Guy was one of the shows that demonstrated what television could mean when the audience had the tools to engage with it actively and persistently, rather than simply passively consuming and moving on. The show's 25-year history has seen the culture around it change substantially. The specific sensibility that made the early episodes feel fresh and boundary-pushing has been absorbed into the mainstream in ways that mean the same content would not produce the same response today. What was transgressive in 1999 is familiar in 2025. The audience's capacity for the specific kind of shock that Family Guy once provided has been recalibrated by decades of increasingly extreme content across all media platforms. The show exists in a different relationship to its audience than it did when it began. What has not changed is the specific comfort that comes from the familiar, from the theme song you know before it starts, from the voices you could identify from any room in the apartment, from the specific quality of being in the company of characters who have been part of your life for long enough that their presence registers as a kind of companionship. Whatever critical account one might give of the show's trajectory, whatever one might say about the choices that were made and the directions that were taken and the mysteries that were left unresolved, the fundamental fact of Family Guy's long presence in many people's lives is real and deserves to be acknowledged on its own terms. There is something genuinely meaningful about a show that has been on television for over 2.5 decades, that has accompanied people through their teenagers and their 20s and their 30s and in some cases their 40s, that has been present in the background of all the different versions of their lives without ever being the most important thing happening, but also without ever fully going away. That endurance is its own kind of achievement, and understanding everything we have explored tonight, the improbable origins, the near miss with disaster, the secrets in the animation, and the characters and the history, makes the endurance feel more meaningful rather than less. The show that has been your background companion is stranger and more remarkable than you probably knew. That is what we found tonight, and now you know. Sleep well, deeper dive, every voice and what it carries. When people think about the voice performances in Family Guy, they most commonly think about Seth MacFarlane's 4 main characters. But the full voice cast of the show across its run represents an extraordinary collection of performers who have contributed to building one of the most orally distinctive casts in the history of animated television. Alex Borstein has voiced Lois Griffin since the show's very first episode. Borstein came to the role with a background in sketch comedy, having been part of the MAD-TV cast, and she brought to Lois a specific quality of warmth and practicality that grounded the character in ways that made her work as the show's emotional center when the show needed one. Lois is often the most difficult character to play well because she occupies the difficult position of being the most normal person in a household full of extraordinary ones, which means her comedy cannot come from extremity but has to come from reaction, and from the specific quality of a person dealing with conditions that exceed any reasonable preparation. Borstein has maintained the character across 25 years of episodes with a consistency that is remarkable and that often goes unnoticed because Lois works so reliably that her working seems effortless. The moments when the character has been pushed into less comfortable territory, when the writing has made Lois into something harder and colder than she was originally, Borstein has navigated with enough skill that the performance remains coherent even when the characterization around it is not. Seth Green voiced Chris Griffin through the show's entire original run and its long revival. Green had established himself as a performer with a specific capacity for a certain kind of sweet, slightly baffled adolescent presence, and Chris is built around that presence in ways that let Green do what he does best while giving the character enough specificity to feel like an actual person rather than simply a comedic type. The specific quality of Chris's good-natured confusion about the world, his openness to experience combined with his complete inability to process most of what he encounters, is conveyed in Green's performance through choices that seem simple but require genuine craft to sustain across so many episodes. The consistency of the main cast across the show's entire run is one of its genuine achievements. The voices that these performers established in the first season are the voices they are still using in the show's current seasons, maintained with enough precision that the characters feel continuous with their earlier selves even when the writing around them has changed substantially. That continuity of performance is not automatic. It requires active maintenance, the continuous practice of inhabiting a specific vocal character in ways that honor what has come before while remaining fresh enough to feel present. Mila Kunis's work as Meg, which we have discussed in the context of the character's narrative history, deserves consideration in purely performative terms. The specific challenge of voicing Meg across the seasons of the show's treatment of her, of finding the truth of the character in episodes that used her as a target, and in episodes that allowed her to be a full person, required flexibility and emotional intelligence that Kunis brought consistently to the role. The moments when Meg broke through the comedy to register as genuinely hurt, or genuinely strong, or genuinely human, work as well as they do because Kunis committed to them as performance rather than simply delivering the lines. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, has brought a specific quality to the character that goes beyond what the writing has always supported. Warburton's voice has a naturally commanding quality, a presence and weight that makes Joe convincing as someone who was once the most admired person in the neighborhood, even in episodes where he is being used as a comedic target. The gap between the voice and the role's diminished status in the later seasons is itself a kind of comedic resource that the show has not always used as skillfully as it could. Mike Henry, who voiced Cleveland Brown through the show's run before and after the spin-off period, brought warmth and groundedness to a character that could easily have been a simple comedic type. Henry's Cleveland had a specific quality of patience that made him feel like a real person navigating a difficult social environment, which gave the character a dignity that the writing did not always provide but that the performance maintained. The guest voices that the show has incorporated across its history represent another dimension of its performative achievement. Family Guy has attracted an extraordinary range of guest performers, from musicians to actors to public figures, and the show has generally used those voices well, finding ways to incorporate the specific qualities of each guest into the comedic fabric of the episode rather than simply deploying their recognizability as its own reward. Deeper dive: the show's relationship with its own history. One of the more interesting things about a show that has been running for 25 years is the relationship it develops with its own past. Family Guy has a specific and somewhat complicated relationship with its own history, acknowledging it when the acknowledgement serves the comedy, while largely declining to be constrained by it in ways that would limit the show's freedom in any given episode. The show has produced several episodes that engage directly with its own history as a subject. Back to the Pilot, which sent Brian and Stewie back to the events of the very first episode, is the most explicit of these, literally revisiting the show's origin point and using it as a location for the episode's adventure. The episode works as both comedy and as a genuine reflection on what the show was at its beginning and what it had become by the point of the episode's production. Watching characters from the later show interact with characters from the first episode makes visible, in ways that a normal episode cannot, exactly how much the show had changed. The show has also occasionally used its anniversary milestones as occasions for more substantial reflection. The 200th episode special gave cast and creators an opportunity to discuss what the show had meant to them across its history, which provided both promotional content and genuine documentation of how the people who made the show understood what they had built. McFarlane's comments in those retrospective contexts often have a quality of genuine affection for the show's history, alongside the less personal framing of why the show continues that his more recent comments tend to emphasize. The episodes that directly address the show's own existence as a television program, breaking the fourth wall to acknowledge that the characters know they are in a show and have opinions about that show, have become more frequent in the later seasons than they were in the early ones. The early seasons used fourth wall breaks sparingly, as specific comedic tools deployed for maximum effect in moments when the surprise of the acknowledgement added something to the joke. The later seasons have used them more casually, as a general mode of meta-commentary that runs through many episodes rather than appearing in selected moments. This shift in how the show treats its own self-awareness reflects a broader change in how American comedy has approached meta-commentary over the period of the show's run. The specific pleasure of a show acknowledging its own artificiality has become less novel and more routine, as the comedy landscape has absorbed meta-awareness as a standard tool, rather than a special one. Family Guy's increasing use of fourth wall breaking in its later seasons reflects and contributes to this broader cultural shift. What has remained consistent is the show's use of callbacks to earlier episodes and earlier moments in its history as a source of comedic reference. These callbacks depend on the audience having the kind of sustained familiarity with the show that a long-running program develops over time. A joke that calls back to something that happened 7 seasons earlier only works if enough of the audience was watching 7 seasons earlier and remembers it, which creates a specific bond between the show and the most dedicated portion of its audience, the viewers who have been there across the whole run and who carry the show's history in a way that new viewers cannot. Family Guy has cultivated this bond deliberately and systematically. The specific kind of devoted long-term viewer who would notice a callback to a Season 3 gag in a Season 22 episode and feel the specific satisfaction of that recognition is the viewer that the show has always understood itself to be making for, alongside but distinct from the casual viewer who watches individual episodes without the accumulated context that makes the callbacks meaningful. This dual audience, the devoted long-term viewer and the casual episodic viewer, has always been present in Family Guy's relationship with its public. The show works for both, but it is the devoted long-term viewer, the person who has been watching since 1999 or since the Adult Swim years, or since they discovered the show in college and worked their way through the entire catalog, for whom the show's accumulated history is most richly available. For that viewer, every episode carries the weight of everything that came before it. Every character choice resonates against the long arc of who the characters have been. Every joke has a context that makes it different than it would be without that context. This essay, this long journey through what Family Guy has been hiding and what it has left unresolved and what happened behind the scenes across 25 years, is addressed to that viewer. The one who is listening now, in the dark, with everything the show has given them already present in their memory, about to discover that what they thought they knew was just the surface of something considerably deeper. The secrets are now yours. The mysteries remain. The show continues. And somewhere in the Griffin's living room, on Lois's piano, the theme song plays. It has always been playing. Final words. What you carry with you now. There is a specific pleasure in falling asleep to something familiar. The comfort of the known, the warmth of voices you have heard enough times that they have become part of the ambient texture of your inner life, the way that familiarity creates a kind of safety that lets the mind release its grip on the day and begin the slow descent toward rest. Family Guy has provided this comfort to millions of people for over 25 years. It has been there in the background of evenings and late nights and early mornings and long afternoons and every other time of day when a person might need something warm and recognizable to fill the space that silence sometimes fills less. Helpfully, what we have done tonight is add something to that familiarity, not replace it, not undermine it, add to it. Because knowing what you did not know before, understanding the improbability of the show's existence and the depth of its mysteries and the specific weight of what its creators and cast and writers put into it over 25 years, does not make the familiarity less comforting. It makes the familiar things feel more remarkable. The theme song is more interesting now that you know Seth MacFarlane had to fight to keep it. The opening shot of Lois at the piano is richer now that you know what the sheet music says. Stewie's voice carries more weight now that you know it is armor. Meg's silence about her own history feels different now that you know what Brian said in the third season while she was wearing headphones. The show you put on tonight, if you put it on after this, will be the same show it always was. The same voices, the same jokes, the same rhythms you know so well that you can finish them before they start. But you will be watching it knowing more than you did before. And that knowledge adds a layer to everything. That is what happens when you learn the secrets. The familiar becomes something more than familiar. It becomes known in a different way. A deeper way, a way that takes into account everything that went into making it what it is. Family Guy is strange and improbable and deeply human in ways that the comedy does not always make visible. It is a show that survived things that should have killed it, that has kept secrets across decades of episodes, that has embedded care and craft in places where almost no one would ever look, that has asked questions about its own characters that it has chosen not to answer because the questions are worth more than the answers would be. It is a show that would not exist if a travel agent had written down the right departure time. And here you are with it, in the quiet dark, at whatever hour it is, wherever you are. Sleep well, friend. The secrets are yours. The mysteries remain. The show keeps going. And now you know it a little better than you did before. Good night. Supplementary section. The show's controversies and what they reveal. Every long-running television show accumulates controversies alongside its achievements. Family Guy has accumulated more than most, which is partly a consequence of the specific creative philosophy that has guided it from the beginning, and partly a consequence of the particular cultural moment it has occupied for 25 years. The show's controversies are worth examining, not as a catalog of failures, but as a record of the specific tensions that a show committed to transgression inevitably generates with the broader culture it is transgressing against. What Family Guy has been criticized for across 25 years tells you something about what kinds of boundaries were being tested in each era and what kinds of transgression the culture was and was not prepared to absorb. In the early years, the controversies were primarily about content. The Parents Television Council, which evaluated primetime programming for family appropriateness, placed Family Guy on its lists of worst programming multiple times in the show's first decade. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints about the show. These controversies were of the straightforward kind that any sufficiently irreverent primetime comedy would expect to generate. Complaints about the specific content of jokes rather than about the show's approach or philosophy. As the show continued and the culture around it shifted, the nature of the controversies shifted as well. The criticism that emerged in the show's middle and later periods was less often about specific content and more often about systemic patterns, about the treatment of specific characters across many episodes rather than about individual jokes, about the cumulative message that the show's choices communicated rather than the specific content of any single scene. The controversy around Meg's treatment is the clearest example of this shift. Individual episodes of the show's abuse of Meg could be criticized on their own terms, and many were. But the more substantial criticism that developed over time was about the pattern rather than the individual instances, about what it meant for a show to systematically degrade one of its main characters across many seasons and call the degradation comedy. This kind of systemic criticism is considerably harder for a show to respond to than individual content complaints because it does not point to a specific thing that can be changed or removed. It points to a pattern that is woven throughout the fabric of the show, and that would require changing the show's fundamental approach to the character to genuinely address. The show's response to this criticism, which was gradual and imperfect but ultimately real, was to pull back from the most extreme treatment of Meg in the later seasons. Beginning around season 14 or 15, the most vicious forms of abuse directed at her began to decrease. The character started getting episodes where she was competent and even capable. The family's treatment of her became less uniformly cruel. The shift was credited in part to changes in the composition of the writing staff, specifically the addition of more women to the room who pushed back against the pattern that had developed. This is worth noting, because it suggests something about how the specific composition of a writing room affects the output of the show. The treatment of Meg got worse when the room was configured in ways that did not include voices that would push back against it. The treatment of Meg got better when those voices were added. The creativity of any writing room is shaped by who is in the room, and the absence of perspectives that would advocate for specific characters or against specific patterns means that those patterns can develop without internal resistance. The show's treatment of its female characters more broadly has been a consistent subject of critical attention. Lois was allowed to be fully realized in the early seasons in ways that the later seasons compressed. The secondary female characters in the show's world, with some exceptions, have generally been more thinly drawn than the secondary male characters. This pattern is common in American comedy television, and Family Guy is neither uniquely bad nor uniquely good on this dimension. But the sheer scale of the show's output over 25 years makes the pattern more visible than it would be in a shorter run. The racial humor in the show has been another source of sustained controversy, not because Family Guy is unusual among American primetime comedies in making racial jokes, but because the specific ways it has made those jokes have sometimes crossed lines that the show's general approach makes difficult to defend. The show has been called out for jokes that function primarily by deploying racial stereotypes rather than by subverting or interrogating them, which is a meaningful distinction for comedy that claims the mantle of social commentary. MacFarlane's response to these controversies has generally been to defend the show's right to make the jokes it makes, while acknowledging that not every joke lands the way it was intended, and that the accumulated effect of the show's approach to sensitive material is something that deserves examination. This is a more nuanced position than either pure defense or pure capitulation, and it reflects the genuine complexity of being responsible for a show that has built its identity on transgression. The controversy around the Boston Marathon episode, which we discussed at length in the context of the show's accidental predictions, is worth revisiting in this context because it represents the clearest case in the show's history, where the controversy was not about the content itself, but about the relationship between that content and specific real-world events. The episode made a joke about violence at the Boston Marathon. Then actual violence occurred at the actual Boston Marathon. The episode was not the cause of the real event, but the relationship between the joke and the event created a responsibility that the show and the network were right to take seriously, which is why the episode was pulled from circulation. This kind of accidental proximity to genuine tragedy is one of the hazards of making comedy about the full range of human experience, including the dark and violent parts. You cannot know in advance which jokes will end up feeling prescient rather than transgressive. You can only commit to the approach and respond responsibly when the approach produces outcomes that were not intended. Supplementary section. The show's relationship with other animations. Family Guy has always existed in relationship with other animated comedies, and those relationships have been productive sources of both creative tension and genuine dialogue about what adult animation can do. The relationship with The Simpsons is the most significant and the most complicated. The Simpsons predated Family Guy by a decade and established the foundational grammar of the adult animated family sitcom in ways that made every subsequent entrant in that space an implicit response to what The Simpsons had built. Family Guy was explicitly not trying to be The Simpsons, which is one of the more honest things that can be said about it in relation to its predecessor. It was trying to do something different with a format that The Simpsons had established, and the specific ways in which it was different, the more aggressive use of cutaway gags, the more extreme character behavior, the more transgressive relationship with content standards, were all ways of distinguishing itself from the show that had defined the territory. The eventual crossover between the two shows, which produced one of the more discussed special episodes in either show's history, generated a specific conversation about the relationship between them that neither show has fully resolved. The episode treated the relationship as one of mutual recognition and mutual skepticism, with characters from both shows acknowledging their similarities while also acknowledging the differences in approach and sensibility that distinguish them. It was a more honest accounting of the relationship between the two shows than most crossover episodes manage, which is itself a reflection of the self-awareness that both shows had developed by the time the crossover was produced. The relationship with South Park is more explicitly adversarial, or at least it has been during specific periods. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, have been public about their disrespect for Family Guy's writing approach, particularly for the cutaway gag format. Their Cartoon Wars episodes, which aired in 2006, depicted Family Guy's jokes as being generated by a random process involving manatees and idea balls, suggesting that the comedy required no genuine skill or thought to produce. This criticism was pointed and widely discussed, and it generated responses from within the Family Guy writing community that ranged from acknowledgement to counterattack. What makes the South Park critique interesting is that it is not simply rivalry. Parker and Stone articulated a specific aesthetic objection to the cutaway format that has merit as criticism of the format when it is used badly. Their argument is that jokes that could be placed anywhere in any episode that do not emerge from character or situation represent a lower form of comedy than jokes that are organic to the specific story being told. This argument is valid in the abstract. It is also somewhat unfair as applied to Family Guy's best work, where the cutaway gags do emerge from specific character knowledge and do have a relationship to what surrounds them. But, as applied to the show's worst work, the criticism lands. The relationship with American Dad, which we have discussed extensively, deserves consideration in the context of what the relationship between sibling shows tells you about the creative infrastructure behind them. Two shows created by the same person, launched at the same time on the same network, taking different approaches to adult animated comedy, and arriving at very different places after the same number of years. The differences between what happened to Family Guy and what happened to American Dad are not attributable to the creator's talent or vision, which was available to both shows, but to the specific creative decisions made by the people running each show in the creator's absence. Supplementary section. What the numbers actually mean. The ratings history of Family Guy is a story told in numbers that span an enormous range, from the 22 million viewers of the premiere episode to the less than 1 million viewers of recent seasons. Understanding what these numbers mean, and what they do not mean, requires some context about how television viewership and television economics have changed across the same period. In 1999, when Family Guy premiered to 22 million viewers, those viewers were choosing from a much smaller menu of entertainment options than today's viewers face. There were 4 major broadcast networks, a smaller selection of cable channels than now, and no streaming services in the form that has come to dominate the entertainment landscape. The audience for any given television program was composed of people who were sitting in front of their televisions during the broadcast window because there was no mechanism for watching later. By 2025, when Family Guy averages viewership numbers that would have represented cancellation territory in 1999, the audience for television has fragmented across hundreds of streaming services, YouTube, social media platforms, and every other mechanism by which entertainment is now delivered. The people who watched Family Guy in 1999 by sitting in front of their televisions at the scheduled broadcast time are now dispersed across all of these platforms, watching when and where they choose, and the number of them who happen to be watching any single live broadcast on any given Wednesday night is a fraction of the people who are consuming the show's content across all platforms simultaneously. The streaming numbers for Family Guy on Hulu and other platforms are not disclosed publicly in the same way that traditional broadcast ratings are. The DVD sales, which were a significant metric during the show's revival period, have become less relevant as physical media has declined. The social media conversation around the show, the clips shared on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram Reels, the discussions on Reddit and dedicated fan platforms, are forms of engagement that do not show up in traditional viewership metrics but that represent real and ongoing cultural presence. The commercial case for Family Guy, which has sustained the show's renewal through 2029 despite declining traditional broadcast numbers, is built on this broader picture of engagement rather than simply on the Wednesday night ratings. The show's value as a library property for streaming, its merchandise revenue, its international distribution, its continued presence in syndication, all of these contribute to an economic picture that makes the show commercially viable at viewership levels that the traditional broadcast model would not support. This context does not make the declining viewership irrelevant. It is a real indicator of how many people are choosing to watch new episodes of Family Guy in a week when they could be watching something else. But it should not be read as the complete story of the show's cultural presence in 2025, which is considerably larger and more complex than any single metric can capture. The show that began with 22 million viewers and that now attracts substantially fewer for its first-run broadcast remains, in the broader landscape of American popular culture, a significant and recognizable presence. Its characters are known to people who have never watched a full episode. Its catchphrases have entered the cultural vocabulary in ways that persist independently of whether people are currently watching the show. Its history, which we have spent this entire journey exploring, is part of the shared cultural knowledge of a generation that grew up with it. That is a different kind of success than the raw viewership numbers suggest, and it is a success that the renewal through 2029 implicitly acknowledges. Family Guy is being kept alive not simply because of its Wednesday night ratings, but because of the totality of what it is and what it represents in the cultural landscape, including the 25 years of history that we have been walking through tonight. Supplementary section. The specific craft of making Stewie work. There is a technical dimension to what Seth MacFarlane does with Stewie Griffin that deserves more attention than it typically receives, because the performance is considerably more complex than it appears when you are simply watching the show and absorbing the character as a familiar presence. The voice that MacFarlane built for Stewie is not a single consistent thing. It is a performance that shifts in register and in emotional temperature from moment to moment, with a precision that communicates enormous amounts of information about Stewie's internal state, without ever abandoning the specific quality of Stewie's voice that makes him recognizable. When Stewie is plotting something dangerous, the voice carries a particular quality of controlled menace. When Stewie is genuinely hurt, which happens more in the later seasons, the voice shifts to something more vulnerable without losing the specific accent and cadence that mark it as Stewie. When Stewie is being absurd for the pure pleasure of being absurd, the voice has a different energy again, lighter and more playful. This range within a consistent vocal identity is the technical achievement. MacFarlane is performing the same character across all these registers while keeping them unified by the specific qualities, the clipped consonants, the precise vowels, the particular rhythm of Stewie's speech, that make the character recognizable. The challenge is that inconsistency in any of these dimensions breaks the spell. If the accent slips in a moment of emotional intensity, the moment does not work. If the rhythm becomes uncertain during a comedic sequence, the joke loses its shape. MacFarlane has maintained this performance across more than 25 years of episodes, with a consistency that represents genuine craft. The Stewie of the most recent seasons is vocally continuous with the Stewie of the first season in ways that make the character's continuity feel real, despite the substantial changes in his personality that we have discussed. Throughout this journey, the voice is the thread that connects the versions of the character across time. The specific origin of the voice, which MacFarlane has described in various interviews as drawing on Rex Harrison's performance as Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady as a primary influence, tells you something about the quality being aimed for. Harrison's Higgins has a specific quality of refined precision, combined with impatience and intellectual vanity that maps onto Stewie in productive ways. The character of a brilliant person who is deeply certain of their own superiority but who is also, beneath the certainty, considerably more vulnerable than they would ever admit is a useful foundation for a character who has had to evolve from pure villain to something much more complicated. Supplementary section. What we owe the show. There is something that deserves to be said directly at the end of this long journey through everything that Family Guy has been hiding and everything it has left unresolved. Something that the critical apparatus of examining what went wrong and what could have been better sometimes makes it easy to forget. This show, in its best moments, has been genuinely extraordinary. The episode where Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault together and spend 22 minutes having honest conversations about mortality and friendship and the specific weight of loneliness is one of the finest single episodes of television comedy produced in the last 25 years. Not because it is funny, though it has its funny moments, because it is true. Because the specific things those two characters say to each other in that vault feel like things that real people feel and almost never say, and the show said them anyway. The Road to Rhode Island, which sent Brian and Stewie on the first of their road trip adventures in 2000, established a format that has produced some of the most emotionally resonant storytelling the show has ever done. The specific combination of Brian's weary adult intelligence and Stewie's strange blend of sophistication and genuine childhood vulnerability creates a dynamic that the show has drawn on across 2 decades without exhausting what is available in it. The musical sequences that the show has produced across its run, beginning with the theme song and extending through the full original compositions that have become embedded in the show's identity, represent a genuine creative achievement. The specific skill required to write comedy songs that are also good songs, that work as music independently of their comedic context, is not common. The show's catalog of original music includes material that holds up on its own terms, separate from the comedy context that produced it. The early seasons, which we have invoked repeatedly as the standard against which everything that followed has been measured, deserve to be honored on their own terms rather than simply as a baseline for measuring decline. Seasons 1 through 3 of Family Guy are genuinely great television. The writing is sharp, the characters are fully realized. The comedy is ambitious in its range and precise in its execution. The heart that makes you care about the Griffins despite everything they do is present in every episode. That is the show that has sustained 25 years of continuation, that has kept people watching and rewatching even as the quality has become uneven, that has generated the kind of passionate fan engagement that makes a journey like this one worthwhile. The secrets and mysteries we have explored tonight exist because people care enough about this world to want to understand it more fully. And that caring is a response to something genuinely worth caring about. Family Guy, at its best, earned the devotion it received. And the devotion that was given to it in those early years has sustained the show through all the seasons since, through all the changes and controversies and creative decisions that have moved it away from what it was. The audience has stayed, or has returned, because what the show gave them in its best moments was worth returning for. That is the final thing worth knowing about Family Guy. After everything else, it was, and in its best moments still is, a show that was capable of making you feel genuinely glad to be watching it. Sleep well, you have earned it. And now you know everything. A closing reflection. The show that would not die. There is one last thing to sit with as tonight draws to a close. One final observation that ties together everything we have moved through in the hours since we began. Family Guy should not exist. That is the honest truth of the matter. A show that was canceled after 3 seasons, that lost its writing staff during the gap between its cancellation and its revival, that survived 2 cancellations when surviving 1 is essentially unheard of, that premiered to 22 million viewers after the Super Bowl, and has spent 25 years proving that the audience who fell in love with it was real enough and devoted enough to keep it alive across every obstacle the television industry could place in its path. The show should not exist because Seth MacFarlane should not have been alive to make it. The specific accident of a hangover and a wrong departure time written down by a travel agent, the 10 minutes that stood between MacFarlane and a seat on the plane that would kill everyone aboard it, is not a footnote in the show's history. It is the show's history. Without that accident, there is no 4th season. There is no Adult Swim revival. There is no Animation Domination's Sunday night lineup. There is no American Dad. There are no 25 years of secrets and predictions and mysteries and moments of genuine extraordinary television. The show exists because of everything that went wrong in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. And you have spent tonight in the company of all of it. The hidden music on the piano, the British accent that was always armor, the real father who left one line of evidence in one season and was never mentioned again, the episode that knew about Kevin Spacey's basement and put the joke on television 14 years before anyone outside that basement knew the same thing. The flights that were missed, and the episodes that were pulled, and the voices that almost belonged to different people entirely. All of this is what Family Guy is, underneath the familiar comedy that has kept you company all these years. The show that should not exist kept existing. The secrets kept existing inside it. And now you carry them with you. That is enough for one night. Sleep now. Good night.